Invisible Strike. Trebium was Book 1 by Matt Edsan. Narrated by Matt Edsan. Chapter 1. Captain's Ready Room. UFS Intrepid. Stanley, you better take care of your vessel. Admiral Harris hollered through the holoscreen. It is the first of its kind to be built using Trebium. Yes, sir. Captain Stanley beamed. He had considered himself fortunate to be posted to command the UFS Intrepid, which was the first in a breed of destroyers. The vessel's hull and exterior had been created using Trebium, a mineral with a high concentration of a combination of metals, which humanity had only in recent years discovered on Euphra. There are many critics waiting in Euphra for you to fail, Harris stated matter-of-factly. Do not disappoint me. Stanley understood the risks. Failure was not an option. The underlying argument for every critic was the exorbitant cost of mining the Trebium. The reality was that the Trebium was found deep in the core of the planet. This required special mines to be created with sufficient mechanisms in place, which further increased the cost. Many of the critics had also written countless articles on the Euphranet, debating whether it was necessary for humanity to waste so much money towards building vessels with Trebium. Their argument was that the current United Federation of Stars, UFS, vessels were more than sufficient to keep the planet safe. It was a valid argument, but Stanley felt that protecting humanity was vital, especially out here in the Vonia system. How is your crew? Harris asked. Stanley sensed the worry lurking behind his tone. Admiral Harris had been the one who had put his name on the line and championed the Trebium mineral project many years ago. With the commissioning of the UFS Intrepid, Admiral Harris's dream of a new breed of vessels had come full circle. My EXO is cooperative, if that is what you mean, Stanley smiled. Stanley knew his posting to the UFS Intrepid had also not been without controversy. Many older captains had been eyeing the new destroyer, but Admiral Harris had the final say in the matter. And Admiral Harris's affection for Stanley, since the days of encountering him in the academy, had played a large role in his decision. Stanley had never expected to be posted as captain to a vessel right after his graduation from the Euphra Academy. He had thought he would have spent some time being the XO under the wing of a more experienced captain. However, Admiral Harris had other plans, which had wrecked the ambitions of many captains. Good, Harris remarked. Keep him in line. He is a good old loyal bird. He won't cause you any problems. His XO, Commander Mendez, had been with the UFS since its inception many years ago, when Euphra was initially colonized. There was no one more experienced than his XO. After the euphoria of his appointment to the UFS Intrepid had passed, Stanley had quickly sought to find out who would be his XO. Admiral Harris had eventually broken the news to him. Initially, Stanley had been wary of Commander Mendez. Would an experienced XO want to work under him? I had to get back to my other work, Harris concluded. Stanley bowed as the holoscreen went blank. As he glanced around the bare ready room, the responsibility of proving the value of the new destroyer class of vessel began to slowly weigh down on him. He was going to show all of his critics what they had been missing and how wrong they had been in their assessment. A buzz on his console broke through his thoughts. Stanley pressed on the console. It was his XO. Yes, Commander Mendez. Commander Mendez's voice was shaky. Captain, we have a problem. In his brief time with the XO, Stanley discovered that Commander Mendez had one key flaw, which was his tendency to beat around the bush without getting directly to the issue at hand. What is it, Stanley asked. We have a contact on the UFS Brennan, Mendez said. Stanley didn't understand why his XO sounded so nervous. It was another destroyer, although an older class one. Nothing of significance came to his mind about the UFS Brennan. It was probably on a routine patrol of the Vonia system. I don't see the problem, Stanley remarked with a slight irritation. He didn't have the time to be tending to every one of his XO's concerns. His XO was experienced to handle many situations without needing to check in with him. We aren't detecting any life signs on board, Mendez highlighted. Chapter 2. Armstrong Station, Euphra Orbit. Admiral Harris looked up from his blank holoscreen. He had faith in Captain Stanley. The young man had been the brightest in his class. Some might argue he would rank up there as a prodigy. He had been glad to have the opportunity to mentor him. There was a buzz at his door. Come in, Admiral Harris shouted. The door opened. It was Commander Ruti. She was in charge of the station operations. There's something I would like you to see, sir, Commander Ruti said. Harris had never seen Ruthie look so pale. Commander Ruthie was one of the bravest women he had ever met. She had been amongst the fastest to rise to the rank of commander in the UFS. Her ability to quickly discern the bigger picture was remarkable. Harris stood up grudgingly. "Commander, this better be worth my time. I have an important call with UFS Central Command in a short while." It was a call he wasn't going to want to miss. UFS Central Command had requested a status update on the Trebium mineral project. The fact of the matter was that the mining of the Trebium had increased by fivefold over the last 6 months. He had been able to secure additional funds and resources despite the concerns of UFS Central Command. To his credit and relief, the media hadn't picked up on the allocation of the additional resources. If they had, he would have been crucified by the media for the next few months. The original estimate of the amount of Trebium at the mines had been significantly wrong. It was apparent that Euphra had hidden within its core an abundant supply of Trebium that would keep them busy for decades to come. Harris had come over to Euphra in the very early years when the first human colony had been established. The planet had been rare in the sense its atmosphere was very close to that of Earth. Euphra had over 70% landmass with the rest covered by waters. Unlike Earth, it had only 2 large continents. However, none of that had stopped the proliferation of human cities across the planet. To him, Euphra was humanity's second chance. And this time they needed to do it better. Harris climbed the steps into the station's operations center. 2 other commanders were manning their stations. Commander Ruthie had instead another word during their walk over to the operations center, which he found unusual as she was quite talkative. She led him to the main console in front of her chair. Commander Ruthie sat down and glanced sideways at her peers before pressing on the console. "Sir, I received this transmission an hour ago," Ruthie explained. Admiral Harris leaned in. "Were you able to translate it?" "The Universal Translator only managed a partial match," Ruthie replied. "It says they're coming for your..." That's it. Not sure if the transmission was incomplete. "Who are they?" Harris mused. "Unable to verify, sir," Ruthie said. He knew Ruthie was capable enough that she would eventually be able to determine the rest of the translation. It was only a matter of time. Even with a partial translation, Harris was disturbed by the message. "Are we able to identify where this signal originated from?" Harris asked. "Negative, sir," Ruthie replied. "Best estimate it was from outside the Vonia system." Harris understood Ruthie's apprehension. It was the first time they had received any kind of transmission from outside of the Vonia system. "Send a copy of this transmission to UFS Central Command immediately," Harris ordered. Ruthie nodded. "Yes, sir." Harris heard a sound and turned to his left. There was no one there. He blinked his eyes once. Hadn't there just been an officer seated over there? He turned back to face Ruthie. Her eyes were full of fear. "What is it?" Harris inquired. He heard a rustling sound behind him as Ruthie went for her holster. There was someone here with them. But that was impossible. As he was about to turn, Harris felt a prick on his neck, and he blacked out. Chapter 3. Bridge, UFS Intrepid. "How far is the shuttle, Captain?" Stanley asked. "A few clicks, Captain," the comms officer reported. Upon the discovery of there being no life signs on board the UFS Brennan, Stanley had ordered Commander Mendez to take a small group on a shuttle to investigate. The UFS Brennan must have either suffered a disaster that depleted its oxygen supply or something worse. Stanley was leaning to something worse. It was impossible for there to be no life on a UFS destroyer. How long had the UFS Brennan been out there, floating in space? Stanley had asked the comms officer to check for any distress calls, but there had been none during the last several days. Stanley had been tempted to report in the discovery. Even his XO had encouraged it, but he wanted to find out what happened first. There was no point just sending a transmission on the discovery of the UFS Brennan without any further details. UFS Central Command would want to know the details. Instead, Stanley had persuaded his XO to lead the team and find out more details. The sensor officer had indicated that the interior of the UFS Brennan had not suffered any breach. That itself further deepened the mystery. Either way, the XO had recommended he and his team wear the suits. Stanley had agreed, as there was no need to take a risk until they knew the real situation on board the UFS Brennan. Shuttle A-23 starting the docking process with the UFS Brennan, Commander Mendez reported through the comms. The shuttle would have to make a manual docking with the lifeless destroyer. "Affirmative, Shuttle A-23, the comms officer replied. Stanley glanced around the bridge. The crew were alert. Tension filled the air. This was the first incident the bridge crew had to deal with ever since the UFS Intrepid was commissioned 2 weeks ago. The bridge crew were a mix of old hands and evergreen officers assigned to their first vessel, just like him. Stanley felt this would be a good test for his new crew. "The shuttle has docked," the comms officer reported. The view screen that had been showing the darkness of space was replaced by a live feed from his Exo's head-mounted recording device. We are now in the airlock, Mendes reported. The view screen was partially occupied by a few of his men, all decked out in their suits, with their weapons leveled ahead of them. Stanley didn't know for how many of these men it was their first mission outside of the destroyer, but he had faith in his Exo's deep experience in space. Prior to being posted to the UFS Intrepid, Mendes had worked under multiple captains over 3 different destroyers. Stanley had been incredibly impressed by his wealth of experience. Mendes' knowledge of destroyers, similar to the UFS Brennan, was second to none. Keep an eye on your sensors, Stanley ordered his comms officer. He didn't know if whatever had done this to the UFS Brennan was still out there or not. Aye, Captain, the comms officer replied. Shields are holding and at 100%, the tactical officer announced. Captain, they're entering the UFS Brennan, the comms officer said. Stanley returned his gaze to the view screen. The boarding party was slowly streaming onto the UFS Brennan. They were walking along a corridor. All is quiet, Mendes reported, and the atmosphere is breathable. None of those observations brought any reassurance to Stanley. Instead, they merely opened up more questions. The men continued to walk straight down the corridor. The emptiness on the live footage was eerie. So far, they had not encountered anything. Any signs of life? Stanley asked. Negative, Mendes replied. Where could all the crew have disappeared to? The destroyer of that class could easily have over 200 crew. Mendes' voice crackled over the comms. We are reaching the bridge. The view screen changed as the bridge of the UFS Brennan took center stage. Just like the rest of the vessel, it was empty. One of the men walked towards the navigation console and examined it. He gestured to the Exo. This ship had a route set for Euphra, Mendes commented. Whatever had happened here, the course had already been set for Euphra, and whoever did this had chosen not to change the route. They had wanted them to find the UFS Brennan. But why? Commander, we found someone, one of the men yelled. The display became erratic as Mendes turned and rushed over to the captain's ready room. As his Exo stepped into the room, one of the men was holding on to a frightened female officer by the shoulders. Chapter 4. Admiral's Office, Euphra Shipyards. Admiral Sheldon opened the door to his office and walked in. He had just concluded his light run around the interior concourse of the shipyards. It was the only place he could find to do his daily run, as he preferred not to run outside the shipyard domes, something he had disciplined himself to do ever since his younger days. He opened the door to his automated shower unit, threw off his clothes, and let the unit cleanse him. Afterwards, he donned his uniform and sat down behind his desk. As Sheldon glanced around the large office, he grimaced. This wasn't where he expected to be at this stage of his career. By now, he had thought he would be seated at UFS Central Command, running oversight over the entire UFS and all its spacefaring vessels. But UFS Central Command, under the direction of the Euphra Council, which formed the civilian government on the planet, had other plans for him, none of which was to his liking. However, like always, he had obeyed the new directives and taken on the responsibility. Ever since the discovery of Trebium several years ago on Euphra and the engineers' abilities to build vessels with the mineral, the shipyards had become the jewel of UFS Central Command. A significant amount of resources had been brought in to build the next class of destroyers. He didn't agree with this focus of UFS Central Command and had made public his objections to the use of Trebium. His concerns had been noted by UFS Central Command, but no actions had been taken. Despite it, Sheldon found himself occupying this office in the shipyards. Although this wasn't his project, he still didn't understand why he was assigned to this post. Admiral Harris had been the sponsor of the Trebium mineral project, which included both the mining of the mineral and the building of the destroyers. Harris had been clever in pulling his weight with UFS Central Command to acquire everything he needed to ensure the building of the destroyers continued unabated. Admiral Harris should be the one occupying this space instead of him. Sheldon's console buzzed. Yes, Commander Walters, Sheldon asked. Sir, I'm sending you the delivery schedule for the month, Commander Walters reported. We are ahead of schedule and there are no issues to report. Noted, Sheldon said. I will look through them and send my approval. With that, he ended the comms. The delivery of the new class of destroyers had been smooth. In reality, there was no rush. Ever since humanity had colonized Euphra 50 years ago, there had been no hostile attacks on the planet. However, he knew better than to be complacent. The devastation of Earth had been done none other than by humanity itself. The focus on expansion had stretched Earth so far that it had broken the cycle of life on the planet. Untold numbers of people had died. He had been witness to that tragedy and would never forget it. In the end, Only a small percentage had been saved through colonization of new worlds. Euphra had been one of those new worlds. The lesson learned on Earth had forced humanity to find multiple new worlds to start afresh. Surprisingly, it had been possible to find new worlds. And the last 50 years had seen a boom of planets, with Euphra being the biggest and most advanced of them all. The console displayed the report. Sheldon looked over it. Everything was in order. He was impressed that the engineers had been able to improve their efficiency by tenfold in building the new destroyers. It was a rare feat. He had to admit that the new class of destroyers would help enhance the UFS capabilities beyond anything anyone would have imagined 50 years ago. The use of Trebium had been approved after rigorous testing had been conducted on it. Trebium appeared to strengthen the hull of the new destroyers by threefold, which in a war with any species would be a significant advantage. Sheldon frowned. He knew Admiral Harris was probably up there on Armstrong Station sipping a liquid with a smile on his face. As Sheldon was about to approve the report, another buzz invaded his office. This buzz was different. He had never heard of it before. The console currently showed a revolving red alert icon on the right corner of his screen. He had never before seen such a red alert icon. Admiral, Sheldon narrowed his eyes as he clicked on the red alert icon. A message opened up. He quickly used his implants to authenticate the message. It was brief. Red alert to Admiral Sheldon. Imminent threat. Lockdown of your area has been initiated. Marine team en route. Chapter 5. Titanic Base, Arcadia. Captain Marine Peters walked out of his room. He had put on his light combat armor. The red alert had come to him early in the morning. It had startled him. Initially, he had thought he had been dreaming, but the red alert from UFS Central Command had been verified through his implants. This was the real thing. His unit had been training for such situations for a long time. He knew one day it would happen. It was highly unlikely for humanity on Euphra to remain isolated without any interactions with other species. The Vonia system was a large one in many hundreds of planets that no one on Euphra had even considered exploring. The chances of all those planets remaining uninhabited was low. The first thing he had done was to send an alert to his unit with instructions to meet him at the combat shuttle in 30 minutes. Peters realized that wasn't much time for his unit, but the urgency of the alert made it necessary. As he stood outside the entrance to the main hangar at the base, the cityscape of Arcadia loomed out ahead of him. Arcadia was the capital city of Euphra, with the largest concentration of humans on the planet. To his knowledge, there had never been any threat, internal or external, to the city, until today. As his platoon began arriving, Lieutenant Cruz walked up to him. "Captain, what's this all about?" "Let's wait for the rest," Peters advised. Once the rest of 9 men and women had reached the entrance to the hangar bay, Peters turned to them. "We have been assigned to protect Admiral Sheldon as there is an imminent threat to his life. The danger is high and unknown. Do not take this assignment lightly. We leave immediately for the Euphra shipyards." Lieutenant Cruz looked like she wanted to say something, but remained silent. Peters then turned and walked onto the combat shuttle that was a few meters behind him. He knew his unit would have questions as to why they were being assigned to protect the UFS Admiral. Despite their possible reservations, his unit was one of the leading rapid deployment forces in Arcadia. Once they were all seated inside the shuttle, the pilot started the engines and the combat shuttle hovered over the base before beginning its 1-hour journey to the shipyard. Arcadia as a city was vast. The city itself was broken up into quadrants. The Titanic base was located in quadrant A9, which was closer to the center of the city, while the shipyards were on the periphery. Cruz turned to him. "Sir, why are they sending us to protect the UFS Admiral? Wouldn't the Euphra security services be more suitable as this is within the city?" That was the first thought Peters had when he had read the alert message. However, Peters knew better than to question instructions. His job was to obey and execute it. At the right time, someone would explain to him the rationale for activating his unit as opposed to the Euphra security services, which had jurisdiction over the city of Arcadia. "I recognize your concerns, Lieutenant, but those are our orders," Peters whispered as he glanced around. Cruz always had a tendency to question a lot of things. Today was no different, but Peters knew their unit wouldn't be activated if the situation didn't warrant it. While his unit was supposed to be deployed for threats outside of the city, this would be an exception. He had wanted to contact his wife and let her know he would be deployed out. However, there had been no time to do that. The pilot turned to him. "ETA 10 minutes, sir." "Acknowledged," Peters nodded. He looked around his unit. Everyone seemed to be in their zone. He preferred it that way. He didn't want any of them to be complacent. He had been running drills for them every other day. Their level of combat readiness was about to be tested, because the truth of the matter was that this was his unit's first deployment into the field. Ever since he had taken command of his unit, there had been no threats that had materialized. No amount of training could replace a live combat situation. Final weapons check, Peter shouted. He then turned and looked at each of the men and women in his unit. They all, including Lieutenant Cruz, acknowledged him. The large domes of the Euphra shipyards came into view as the combat shuttle approached the landing pad. After it had touched down, Captain Peters led the team out. A tall man with blonde hair in a grey UFS uniform stood waiting for them. Captain Peters, I presume, the uniformed man asked. My name is Lieutenant Storen. Peters nodded. Lieutenant, what is your status? Follow me, please, Lieutenant Storen indicated. Admiral Sheldon is currently under lockdown in his office within the shipyard dome itself. No one is able to go in or out. I was outside the dome when the alert came in and the lockdown was auto-activated. And the Admiral? Peters asked. The Admiral is okay, Lieutenant Storen replied, as he led them round a corner towards the dome complex. Peters glanced back at his team. Lieutenant Cruz, keep your eyes open. Cruz nodded and signaled to the rest of the platoon. Although they were at the shipyards, which was typically protected by Euphra security services, the alert had highlighted an imminent threat. As Peters turned back to face the nearest dome, a reflection in the distance caught his eye. He squinted his eyes. What is that? Storen looked ahead, and before he could say another word, Peters leveled his weapon in front of him and broke into a run. Ahead of him, two figures donned in shiny spacesuits of some kind were trying to infiltrate the shipyard dome. One of the two figures was using some kind of device against the dome wall. Peters instantly knew those two figures weren't supposed to be here. Stop, or I will shoot, Peters shouted as he fired his weapon at the two figures. Chapter 6. Meeting Room, UFS Intrepid. Captain Stanley stared at the female officer seated opposite him. In her hands was a liquid that one of his officers had provided to the frightened woman. Commander Mendez and his team had not found anyone else on board the UFS Brennan except for this officer. Stanley found it strange that she had been able to survive whatever had happened. The entire vessel was like a ghost ship drifting along in space. Captain, how can I help you? The female officer asked, as she set the liquid on the table. I already told everything to your Commander Mendez on the way over here. How is the drink, Lieutenant Torrey? Stanley asked. Lieutenant Torrey smiled. It is fine, sir. Mendez had briefed him that Lieutenant Torrey had been mumbling nonsensical things when they had first found her. Most likely, she had been in shock. After Mendez had let her calm down, they had taken her back to the shuttle and let her stay there while they searched the rest of the UFS Brennan. Mendez had reported that all the escape pods were accounted for. There were no physical signs of any breach of the destroyer and no indications of any struggle anywhere on the vessel. From the report his XO had submitted, it was as if the entire crew had just vanished into thin air, except for Lieutenant Torrey. None of it made any sense. Stanley had hoped that the XO's investigation could have shed more light on what had happened to the crew. Instead, the opposite had occurred. I just wanted to clarify a few details that you told my XO, Stanley said. Lieutenant Torrey nodded. How did you end up hiding in the captain's ready room? Stanley asked. My captain asked me to pick up some documents he had left behind on his desk, Lieutenant Torrey explained. After I went in, I left the door slightly ajar. I didn't want people to think I was doing something wrong in the captain's ready room, you know. Stanley understood her concerns. Anyway, after I stepped inside the room, I heard a slight noise, Torrey continued. Initially, I ignored it, but then I heard it again. What kind of noise? Stanley inquired. Although the report had all the details, he wanted to hear it from her lips. Like a gasp or choking sound, Torrey replied. The second time I heard it, I quickly turned around and approached the door. That was when I saw the figures. She paused for a bit before continuing. They were wearing a silver spacesuit-like uniform, I think. There was a slight shimmer to it. Stanley didn't recall such details being in his XO's report. That was why he had wanted to meet Lieutenant Torrey in person. There were always things people forgot to tell during the official debrief. It was a common occurrence. Torrey blushed. I may have forgotten to tell your XO about it. How many were there on the bridge? Stanley asked. From my angle, I only saw 2 of them, Torrey stated. After that, I turned and hid myself inside a panel. I didn't know what else to do. My fear kicked in. I was so scared I knew I was no match for whoever was outside there. Did those figures ever enter the captain's ready room? Stanley asked. I'm not sure, Torrey replied. Stanley still had no answer as to why Lieutenant Torrey had been spared by the attackers. She was a typical officer who had been fortunate to be at the right place at the right time. I also don't know what the 2 figures had been doing, Torrey sighed. I was distracted by the shimmer and then panic set in. I should have taken my weapon and gone after them. Hiding was a cowardly decision. Hiding was what saved you, Stanley remarked. You did the right thing. If not for you hiding and surviving this attack, we wouldn't have any of this valuable intelligence. Stanley caught himself using the word attack. Had he become presumptuous to classify the situation on the US Brennan as an attack? But it was true. Every fiber in his body said the UFS Brennan had been attacked by an outside force. There was nothing else it could be. But for an outside force to be able to penetrate a destroyer through a shield and hull meant they were dealing with a deadly and technologically advanced alien species. After you hid in the panel, did you look out again from the captain's ready room? Stanley asked. Tori shook her head. I just sat inside the panel and waited. I know it sounds stupid because I didn't even know how long I would need to stay there. Looking back on it, I should have taken a look outside after a few hours. Thank you for all the information, Stanley highlighted. You're free to go. That was as much as he was going to get from the female officer. He made a mental note about the shimmer she had mentioned. There might be nothing or could be something. Tori stood up. Thank you, Captain. She then opened the door and left the room. Stanley looked at the empty liquid container on the table. The foreign force that attacked the UFS Brennan must have had the capability to remove all the crew simultaneously. That would require a lot of aliens, if it was an alien species. His thoughts were interrupted by a buzz at the door. Mendez stepped into the room. Captain, we downloaded and viewed through the logs and video footage on the UFS Brennan. There was something you need to see. Stanley motioned to his exo. Mendez pulled out a device and placed it on the table. Then he pressed on a button and the device started playing a holographic projection of the video footage. It showed the bridge of the UFS Brennan. As you can see, there's nothing unusual going on, Mendez remarked. Everyone is at their stations, including the captain. Then, there was a brief distortion to the video footage, and once it cleared, the bridge was empty. What was that? Stanley asked. The best we can assess was that it was a distortion, Mendez replied. It may have been initiated by whoever attacked the vessel. Stanley leaned on the device. Replay that last part again. Mendez frowned but pressed on the device. The same video footage began to play again. Stanley paused it right before the distortion took place. Do you see it? Stanley asked. Mendez looked confused as he examined the video footage. Sir, I don't understand. Do you see that reflection on the captain's console? Stanley commented. Mendez leaned forward. Sir, yes, I see it now. Find out what that reflection is all about, Stanley ordered. Chapter 7. Admiral's Office, Euphra Shipyard. The waiting had been more excruciating than the not knowing of the imminent threat. 2 hours had passed by since he had received the red alert message. It had been the first time he had received such a message on Euphra. Sheldon had drummed his fingers staring at the message, trying in vain to decipher any clues from it, but there had been none for him. Then he had paced up and down the office waiting to hear any news. He had expected at least Lieutenant Storen to communicate with him, but he hadn't received any messages from him either. He didn't even know if Lieutenant Storen was still alive or not. The red alert message had indicated a Marine unit was en route to protect him. He found it strange that the Marine unit would be deployed instead of Euphra security services. However, the details of the imminent threat were still unknown to him, but he figured it had to be pretty serious for the UFS to deploy a Marine unit. A few minutes later, Admiral Sheldon heard the first sounds of weapons fire. It was coming from directly ahead of him. By the faintness of the sounds, he guessed it was happening outside the shipyard dome. The weapons fire went on for a while before it stopped. Was this why the Marine unit had been activated? Admiral Sheldon had no doubt of it. He began to pace the room again, counting off the seconds. What was taking the Marine unit so long to neutralize the threat and reach him? Then there was a sound at the door. Sheldon's body stiffened. He pulled out the light arms weapon and leveled it in the direction of the door. If that was the imminent threat, he wasn't going out without a fight. An explosion rocked the door and debris flew about in every direction. Smoke pierced his room as Sheldon covered his eyes. A male voice yelled through the smoke. Admiral Sheldon, this is Captain Peters from the Marine unit sent to protect you. I'm coming in. A man in light combat armor came into his view. He had a weapon in his hands, but it was pointed towards the ground. The tension left Admiral Sheldon's body as his eyes locked in with those of Captain Peters. Sir, are you okay? Peters asked. Sheldon nodded. What's going on? I heard weapons fired. Sir, that is correct, but we need to first move you to the underground bunker in this dome, Peters stated. Sheldon knew when his question was being ignored. Captain, I'm not going anywhere until I have a reasonable explanation of what is going on. He knew he was being stubborn, but the lack of information had been slowly eating away at him. Peters looked flustered. While we were walking over to the dome from our transport, we detected 2 armed foreign entities trying to penetrate the dome you are in. Foreign entities? Sheldon asked. Was that the best explanation the Marine captain had? Surely they could have identified and captured the foreign entities. Yes, sir, Peters replied. When we approached the foreign entities, they stopped what they were doing, fled, and disappeared. Sheldon lifted his eyebrows. Are you saying the foreign entities are still at large? That's why we need to move you immediately, Peters replied. My unit is currently checking the perimeter of this dome. As of now, we are unable to confirm the exact location of the two foreign entities. Sheldon nodded. Let's get out of here. He followed Peters out of his office. Outside, Lieutenant Storen was waiting for them. Sheldon was relieved to note that the lieutenant assigned to him at the shipyards was still alive. Admiral, I'm glad you are alive, Storen said. Sheldon waved at him and followed Peters while Lieutenant Storen and another Marine took the rear. Peters led him down a corridor. At the end of the corridor was a steel door with a retinal scanner on the panel. Peters stepped aside. Admiral, please. Sheldon moved forward and placed his face on the retinal scanner. He was the only one who could gain initial access to the underground bunker. There was a clicking sound, and the door opened inwards to reveal a staircase heading below the surface. Lieutenant Storen, please escort the Admiral below. Peters directed. I will join you shortly. Sheldon followed his lieutenant down the stairs until they reached the bottom. The door at the top of the stairs sealed shut, ensuring no one else would be able to get in without permission. The moment they reached the bottom, the lights flicked on to reveal a large underground bunker with 3 doors at one end, presumably leading to rooms. Sheldon grabbed Storen by the shoulder. What's going on? Storen shivered. I don't know, sir. I received the same red alert message you got and then began following the protocols. It's the first time I have ever received such an alert. Storen had been working at the shipyards for many years. During the initial days after his assignment, Sheldon had often relied on the older man when he needed. Sheldon walked over to one of the chairs around a large table and sat down. Did you catch a glimpse of the foreign entities? Storen shook his head. Before I could see what was happening, Captain Peters began running towards them with his weapon. Sheldon frowned. Sir, you need to activate the console, Storen said softly. Of course. Sheldon got up and went over to the large wall of console panels and a single long display on the left of the bunker. He hesitated as he tried to recall the steps he needed to follow. To his relief, Storen showed him a device containing the instructions. Sheldon pressed on the green button and used his voice to activate the console panel. A hum invaded the underground bunker as the green and blue lights on the console panel lit up. Sheldon sat down at the center console. The console's display initiated a system startup. It took a few minutes for the startup sequence to go through its process. Once the console was started up, Sheldon pressed on the button to create a comms link with UFS Central Command. A hollow screen appeared, with that of a male officer from UFS Central Command. Admiral Sheldon, the officer mumbled, visibly surprised to see him. May I talk to Admiral Palmer? Sheldon asked. The officer looked off-screen before returning his attention to the hollow screen. Sir, Admiral Palmer is uncontactable at the moment. Okay, get me Admiral Harris then, Sheldon ordered. He didn't like talking to Admiral Harris, but he didn't have a choice. There were only 3 admirals in the entire UFS. The UFS was still in the process of grooming future admirals, but it wouldn't happen anytime soon. The officer blinked. Admiral Harris is currently on Armstrong's station, and we lost contact with him an hour ago. Sheldon raised his voice. Are you saying I'm the only UFS admiral still alive? It had been a resource crunch that had led to the UFS wanting to only have 3 admirals and no vice admirals. He had been part of the committee that had come to that painstaking decision. Looking back now, it had been a grave mistake. The officer nodded. Yes, sir. We presume the other 2 admirals are dead. That was why UFS Central Command triggered the red alert to you. Chapter 8. Bridge, UFS Intrepid. Stanley looked out at the view screen. They had managed to stop the UFS Brennan from continuing on its intended navigational route. The destroyer was just another dead vessel in space. UFS Central Command would eventually need to send a crew to bring the vessel back to Euphra. What is our next course of action? Commander Mendez asked. Stanley didn't know how to answer his XO. He had submitted a report to UFS Central Command as well as Admiral Harris. The report had also included a data dump of the logs from the UFS Brennan, but there had been no reply as yet. He had expected Admiral Harris to be prompt in replying, but it was possible the Admiral was busy with more urgent matters. Mendez had suggested sending a skeleton crew to bring the UFS Brennan back to Euphra. It was a clear plan, but Stanley had hesitated. There were still too many unknowns with regards to what had happened to the UFS Brennan. He didn't want to risk any of his crew until it was confirmed what exactly had happened to the UFS Brennan. He hoped Admiral Harris would be able to provide some necessary guidance. Then, an explosion ripped through the UFS Brennan as the vessel broke apart into the front and rear sections. Multiple additional explosions occurred on the 2 halves of the destroyer as it was consumed by the flames. Battle stations, the XO shouted. What just happened? Stanley asked in disbelief. It's possible that whoever attacked the destroyer had left some explosive on it, the XO mused. The location where the UFS Brennan had been floating was now nothing but a large debris field. Stanley eyed the view screen. Something further away from the debris field caught his eye. What was it? We have contact beyond the debris field, the sensor officer reported. Magnify that right quadrant, Stanley ordered. His eyes hadn't deceived him. Initially, he had thought it was part of a section of the UFS Brennan. However, the shape of the object didn't seem to make that theory plausible. The view screen zoomed in and revealed an oval-shaped vessel. It was unlike anything Stanley had ever seen before. He turned to his XO. Have you ever seen something like that before? No, sir, the XO replied. That was all Stanley needed to know. There was no clear reason for that vessel to appear right after the UFS Brennan was blown to bits. He would bet his life that the oval-shaped ship has something to do with the destruction of the UFS Brennan. Are we in weapons range? Stanley asked. In 30 seconds we will be, sir, the tactical officer replied. Shields are up. Prepare to engage, Stanley ordered. Use the mag-rail guns. Fire at will. The UFS Intrepid was outfitted with the latest technological advances in weaponry. While the Trebium hull was what most people talked about when discussing a new class of destroyers, they often overlooked the weapons on board the vessels. It was about time they tested out the third-generation mag-rail guns on a live target. 5, 4, 3, the tactical officer announced. Firing now. The view screen was filled with the slugs of mag-rail guns as they sped at breakneck speed, directed towards the oval-shaped vessel. Are they firing back? The XO asked. No visible reaction, the sensor officer highlighted. Why aren't they firing back? Their sensors must have picked up on our weapons fire. Any impact on their vessel? Stanley asked. The oval-shaped ship hadn't even moved once they had targeted and fired at it. It was as if the oval-shaped ship was ignoring their weapons fire. None, sir, the sensor officer reported. It's like our weapons fire didn't even touch them. Did our weapons fire miss them? Stanley questioned. Negative, sir, the tactical officer replied. Hail them, Stanley ordered. No reply, sir, the comms officer reported. Stanley turned to his XO. What do you think? He wasn't stupid to ask for advice. His XO had been working on UFS ships longer than he had been alive. Before his XO could answer, the sensor officer interrupted him. Sir, the ship is gone. Chapter 9. Outside the domes, Euphra shipyards. I haven't seen anything like this before, Lieutenant Cruz remarked as a gloved hand touched the surface of the dome. The first signs of a precise circular incision was the only evidence left of the two figures that Peters had detected as he had approached the first dome. His first warning shot had done nothing. The two figures had appeared to have ignored it. Then, Peters had fired his weapon a few more times, with Cruz adding to the weapon's barrage. This had caught the attention of the two figures and forced them to stop their attempt in trying to penetrate the dome's exterior structure. Neither of the two figures had returned fire. Instead, the two figures had turned and run off down the side of the dome. Peters, with Cruz, had chased them while the rest of his unit had taken up positions near the only entrance to the dome. Once Peters had turned the corner around the dome, the two figures had vanished. It was as if they had been whisked away by some unseen force. There was nowhere for them to hide. Peters couldn't understand the disappearance. He hadn't been firing at nothing. Those figures had been there, and the stark evidence was right now in front of his eyes. Cruz scraped off some of the powder around the circular incision on the dome's surface and placed it into a small wheel. I'll get someone at the science division to analyze the contents. There might be something there for us. Peters felt a buzz on his device. He pulled it out and looked at it. Lieutenant Storen has sent me the video footage of this area. Cruz leaned in as Peters pressed the button to initiate the replay of the video footage. A holographic projection appeared mid-air in front of them. The two figures hadn't realized there were video recording devices fitted around the dome. It had been part of a detailed security protocol for the Euphra shipyards, especially with their focus on building the next-generation destroyers. Peters had heard about this initiative through his colonel, but he didn't know enough about the details. He suspected the two figures may have been after the destroyers, but the issued imminent threat had been for the admiral. Why would the two figures go after the admiral? It's starting, Peters remarked as the video footage began playing. The video was a bit grainy, but it clearly showed the area where he had spotted the two figures. Initially, the video showed an empty area. Then there was a distortion in the video. What was that? Cruz asked. Peters gestured for his lieutenant to be patient. There should be more. After the distortion, Peters saw himself and Cruz running onto the video footage with their weapons aimed. Then the video footage stopped. Cruz scratched her head. Where are the two figures? Peters narrowed his eyes. It cannot be. He replayed the video footage a second time, but there was no difference. Had someone tampered with the video footage? It wasn't impossible. It couldn't have been the two figures they had chased because they had no time to do it. Lieutenant Storen was the only other person who handled the video footage, but he would have no reason to do it. If Storen was working with the two figures, he would have easily given them access into the dome. I don't believe it, sir, Cruz lamented. First we lose the two figures, now the video footage looks as if the two figures never existed. Peters turned to face the dome structure. Can you reach that recording device? Cruz, being taller of the two of them, climbed up and pulled down the recording device. Captain, what do you want to do with it? Cruz asked as she examined the small device in her hands. Pass it to me, Peters ordered. Peters looked at the video device. It didn't look like anyone had tampered with the device. As he was about to open it up, he stopped. What's this? Sir, isn't that the same powder? Cruz's voice trailed off. Inside the video recording device was another circular incision with a black powder within it. Peters knew that the powder was going to be identical to that on the dome's surface. How had the powder gotten into the video recording device? Had the two figures done something to the video recording device before trying to penetrate the dome's surface? Chapter 10. Underground Bunker, Euphra Shipyards. Admiral Sheldon glanced at the list on the hollow screen. The left column of the list consisted of all the commanders and captains in the UFS. The right column of the list consisted of their current whereabouts. To begin with, it wasn't a long list. The UFS had intentionally kept its numbers of commanders and captains to a dozen or more. The rationale behind that thinking had been that there wasn't an urgent need to have so many captains. The UFS had more than sufficient for its current fleet of destroyers and other vessels, but that decision had been fraught with complacency. However, the startling reality of the list was the right column. More than 90% of the people on it were deemed uncontactable. Did that mean they were also presumed dead like its two other counterpart admirals? If so, it meant that there was a covert attack happening against certain figures in the UFS. The remaining 10% were either on vessels roaming the region of space or on shore leave. On instinct, Sheldon had requested UFS Central Command to send him a list of all the commanders and captains and their whereabouts. The young officer at UFS Central Command had initially looked puzzled but had responded promptly. Sheldon knew the task was an easy one. Every commander, captain, and admiral had an implant that regularly sent back data on each person to a central system. If he recalled correctly, it was done on a daily basis. The system had been devised in the early days of colonizing Euphra with the intention of actively tracking certain figures of high rank in the UFS. At the start, many people in the UFS had balked at it as an invasion of privacy. UFS Central Command had conducted a series of briefings to try and stem the tide of doubts and highlighted the need for it out of an abundance of caution. And over time, those briefings had helped. People had come on board with the system as it had been fine-tuned to only send data on the status of the individual, including whether they were contactable or not, without highlighting their exact location. Sheldon turned to Storen. Lieutenant, what do you see? Sir, we have a lot of missing individuals, Storen replied. That is the obvious, Sheldon said. What else? That had been one of the problems with promoting many lieutenants to commanders and subsequently captains. They lacked the necessary awareness to read between the lines and discern the bigger picture. For a captain, among other things, that was a requirement before being recommended to a post on a vessel. Storen stammered, I am not sure. We are under attack, Sheldon highlighted. Get me General Myers. Sheldon hoped that General Myers wasn't also uncontactable. He was in charge of all the ground forces on Euphra. Sheldon breathed a sigh of relief as General Myers' face appeared on the hollow screen. There was no need to ask the general if he was up to date on what was happening. His face said it all. Sheldon, I've been waiting to hear from you, General Myers remarked. For a little while I thought you had also been killed by this attack. It's good to see you are alive. Myers was always to the point. He had no time to waste in mindless chit-chat. General, I have your Marine unit to thank for that, Sheldon commented. When the system recognized a certain threshold of key individuals had become uncontactable, it initiated the protocols, Myers highlighted. Captain Peters is also one of my strongest. If there is anyone who can protect you against whatever we are up against, it will be him. It also helped that Peters was the general's youngest son. Sheldon had felt honored that Myers had been willing to risk his own son for his safety. But he knew Myers always placed Euphra and humanity before any one individual, and that also extended to his own family. I just sent you the list, Sheldon said. Have you seen it? Yes, Myers replied. Myers' eyes shifted briefly off-screen. Sheldon presumed the general was looking at the list he had just sent him. I'm amazed that whoever is doing this is able to get to most of our key UFS individuals concurrently, Myers said. This points to the fact that it must be the work of an advanced alien species. No one else could pull off something like this with such precision. We lost a lot of good men and women already, Sheldon sighed. Any issues on your end? Surprisingly, it has been quiet here. My colonel and all the majors are still contactable. I have been informed that the Euphra Council have been evacuated to an underground bunker in Arcadia and are all safe. My guess is that this enemy is focused on killing off our space defense capabilities first. Eventually, they will come for the rest of us. I have no doubt about it. General Myers was an experienced war hero from the days of Earth. When nations had realized that Earth was in its final days, concurrent ground wars had spread across the planet. Myers had been called to lead the fight against those battles. Sheldon had been a younger officer in those days. Although he hadn't been spared the horrors of those wars, Sheldon couldn't discount Myers' wisdom even at his old age. The general was a war hero of another age. Many would claim Myers to be Earth's greatest general. Rumors had been rampant that Myers would be announcing his retirement in the coming weeks. Sheldon suspected that announcement would now take a back seat to the current crisis. Does your side have intelligence on any sentient species that might be likely to try something like this? Myers asked. Sheldon shook his head. We are still going through the files. It was a partial lie, but he had no choice. Sheldon had asked Thorin to check on the intelligence reports within the last few months. However, it would take time. Despite that, he had the feeling that those reports would reveal nothing of value. Okay, you can update me once we have any news, Myers said. I would also request you to take a look at the latest reports submitted by Captain Stanley on the matter of the UFS Brennan. My initial thoughts are that it is related. Sheldon acknowledged the general and the holoscreen flickered off. What report by Captain Stanley? Sheldon hollered at Thorin. He hated being caught unaware of things. In all the excitement of the imminent threat, I forgot to give it to you, Thorin said softly. Sheldon closed his eyes briefly. Even in the middle of a crisis with an unknown and technologically advanced enemy, humanity was making mistakes. Chapter 11. Armstrong Station, Euphra Orbit. Lieutenant Diaz stared at the empty briefing room. She checked her time. Commander Ruti was late. It was very unlike of the commander to be late. She was a stickler for reporting on time and had a temper when people reported late to her, even if they were late by a few seconds. Diaz understood it was the commander's way of instilling discipline into the new staff on the station. Diaz had only been posted to Armstrong Station a month back. It had taken a lot of time to get used to the routine, but felt she had mastered it. Where is she? Diaz muttered under her breath. 2 days ago, Ruti had informed Diaz that she was going to be assigned to a new rotation. Upon hearing the news, Diaz had been excited. She looked forward to new opportunities to stretch herself and make contributions to the team on the space station. Diaz checked the time again. She then decided to go and look for the commander, who would normally be in the station's operations center. Diaz slipped out of the briefing room and began walking down the corridor. She got into the lift and walked out into another corridor that led into the operations center. It was eerily quiet at this hour, but that was expected. Armstrong Station was operating on a very lean team. There had been murmurs about it amongst her peers even before she had been posted here. The lean staff had probably been the driver to her posting occurring faster than expected. Despite that, she had looked forward to her posting as a new chance to serve UFS. Diaz stopped at the entrance to the operations center. The signage restricted access on her right boldly proclaimed who could enter the room. This was very unlike her to go barging into an area of the station that wasn't part of her rotation, but she had felt a sense of urgency come over her. In the short time that she had known Ruti, it was clear the commander spent a lot of time in the operations center. If Ruti was inside working on an urgent matter and had simply forgotten about the briefing, Diaz knew she would get a reprimand from Ruti. However, Diaz had a feeling something was amiss. She climbed the steps, opened the door, and gently walked into the operations center. She expected to see several pairs of eyes glaring at her, but the operations center was empty. She glanced around the center. There was no one. That couldn't be possible. According to protocol, the operations center was always manned. It was part of the station's operational readiness. Diaz slowly walked up to the chair at the center. From her memory, it was where Ruti would typically sit. She recalled it from the day one tour they had been given of the station. Ruti's chair was facing her. Diaz glanced around again and took a seat at Ruti's chair. The chair was comfortable. She leaned forward and saw the following words on the Universal Translator. They are coming for your... She didn't understand what the message was about. Instead, she tried to open a comms link with the other commanders on the station. She managed to find their names and tried to open the comms link. However, there was no reply. There were 3 other commanders on board Armstrong Station. It was unlikely for all of them to be uncontactable. Diaz next tried the admiral who was on board. The same silence greeted her again. Then, a buzz appeared on the console. Diaz nearly jumped at the sound. A hollow screen opened up to her right, and a man in an admiral's uniform stared at her. Commander Ruti, is that you? Chapter 12. General's Office, Euphra Defense Forces, Headquarters. General Myers flipped the switch and the hollow screen flickered on. It was Captain Peters. Yes, Captain, Myers asked. Although this was his youngest son, he talked to him no differently than any other soldier. That was part of his internal rules of conduct that he followed and which he had also imparted to all his children who served. Myers had requested for Peters to directly update him on a regular basis. We found video footage of the area outside the Euphra shipyards. Peters replied. Peters had sent him an update on the attempt by two figures to get to Admiral Sheldon. The update had indicated a suspicion to assassinate Sheldon. Myers had scoffed when he saw the update. There was nothing to suspect here. It was clear. The two figures had wanted to take out Sheldon like the other admirals. Of all the admirals, Sheldon was the lucky one. But Myers didn't know yet what had brought Sheldon such good fortune. I'm sending over the footage to you now. There was nothing on it except. Myers raised his eyebrows. Except what? Sir, it is probably nothing, Peters remarked. I will decide that, Myers said, slightly irritated. Now what was it that you saw on the video footage? Peters swallowed. A distortion. It happened right before my image came on it. There was nothing visible of the two figures that I mentioned in my report to you. Distortion? Myers repeated. Something clicked in place. He opened another screen and reviewed the report that had been submitted by Captain Stanley. That had also cited a distortion on the UFS Brennan Bridge video footage. It couldn't be a coincidence. Peters must have recognized his concern. What is it? Myers was the closest to Peters of all his three children. A report submitted by a destroyer captain also indicated a distortion. Myers then shared briefly the details of the encounter with the UFS Brennan. They are linked, Peters commented. It has to be the same alien species. Aren't we jumping the gun, Myers asked. Peters frowned. About an alien species? I don't think so. There is some crazy technology at play here. If not, why does the video footage show nothing? Myers smiled. He admired his son. He had the acumen to do greater things if he wanted to. But right now his son was satisfied with being a Marine captain. Recalling his own time as a Marine captain, Myers had never been satisfied with anything. He had always aspired to go higher and serve his people well. I don't think Admiral Sheldon is smart enough to survive, Myers said. He got lucky for some reason, which we don't know why yet. But I doubt he can stay alive for long, especially since we do not know where the two figures disappeared to. My unit will protect him, Peters stated. Of course you will, Myers said. Myers smiled at his younger son. He expected nothing less from him. Whatever these things are, we aren't going to let them get closer to the Admiral, Peters added. I promise that. Myers nodded and saluted his son, who saluted him back, and then the hollow screen went blank. Peters had inherited a lot of his late wife's idealism. It would serve his son only to a certain extent, and that itself was the danger. Despite that, Myers studied again the video footage his son had sent over. The entire crew, except for one survivor of a destroyer vessel, had been killed by these aliens in space without leaving a trace. But two of these aliens struggled to penetrate the dome of the Euphra shipyards. It didn't make sense. Although Myers knew he was of advanced age, there was something missing, and he knew it was right in front of his eyes. Chapter 13. Underground Bunker, Euphra Shipyards. When the woman on the hollow screen didn't reply to him, Admiral Sheldon realized that this, in fact, wasn't Commander Ruti. He had never spoken to Commander Ruti before, but the appearance of a woman at her station had made him hopeful. Sir, Commander Ruti is missing, Lieutenant Diaz replied. Who am I talking to? Sheldon inquired. My name is Lieutenant Diaz, Diaz said. I was just posted to the station a month ago. Who else is there on the station? Sheldon asked. All the other staff should be around except for the commanders and the Admiral, Diaz said. Do you mean none of your superiors on the station are contactable? Sheldon asked. Sheldon didn't want to allude to their deaths yet. It wasn't confirmed until their bodies had been recovered. Affirmative, sir, Diaz agreed. Sheldon clenched his fists. He couldn't believe that a new young lieutenant was the highest-ranking officer left on Armstrong Station. Maybe you can explain to me how you got to Commander Ruti's station, Sheldon inquired. Sheldon listened as Diaz explained how she came to be at Commander Ruti's console. The young woman was brave to go up into the operations center without permission. Due to security considerations, the operations center at the station would have been classified as restricted access. Diaz must have read his mind. Sir, I understand I shouldn't be here, but... Sheldon waved his hand. We don't need to debate protocol right now. Have you had time to determine what Commander Ruti was doing right before she became uncontactable? He was taking a risk asking a junior officer to investigate the disappearance of Commander Ruti, Admiral Harris, and the others. However, his options were limited. It would take too long to get a vessel up to Armstrong Station, and it might be dangerous as they still didn't know what they were up against. Diaz nodded and shared what she had found. Sheldon realized it wasn't much, but the translated message had some purpose. It may have been the last thing Commander Ruti was doing before she disappeared. Lieutenant, I need you to do a few things for me, Sheldon said. I'm sending it over now. Lieutenant Storen will follow up with you once you have finished. With that, Sheldon switched off the holo screen. Sir, can she handle it? Storen asked. We'll find out, Sheldon replied. Please monitor her progress. Storen got the hint, walked over to another console further away and sat down to follow his instructions. Sheldon took a deep breath as he opened a holoscreen for Captain Stanley. He never liked Stanley and was of the view that he only got the command of the UFS Intrepid because of Admiral Harris. Harris always had a soft spot for the young captain. He had heard of it during Harris's time teaching at the academy. It wasn't something he could ever prove, but now it didn't seem to matter. The holoscreen flickered and Captain Stanley's face appeared on it. Admiral, Stanley said. Stanley, I read through the report you submitted to UFS Central Command, Sheldon admitted. He caught a glimpse of surprise on the young captain's face. It was apparent he didn't know what was happening on the planet's surface. Acknowledged, sir, Stanley replied. May I know if Admiral Harris has read through it too? We didn't receive any reply from him. Sheldon bit his lip. Admiral Harris is uncontactable. So are the commanders on Armstrong Station. Despite Sheldon's personal opinion on Stanley, he took no pleasure in informing him about the demise of Admiral Harris. He hoped Stanley could deduce his meaning of being uncontactable. Stanley stammered. Since when? The young captain struggled to cover his emotions. Sheldon expected it since Stanley had been close to Admiral Harris. We are still investigating the matter, Sheldon replied. As of now, I am the only remaining UFS admiral who is still alive. I am under lockdown in an underground bunker at Euphra shipyard. All UFS command authority has been routed to me. Understand? Yes, sir, Stanley said. Have you been able to get anything from the lone survivor of the UFS Brennan? Sheldon inquired. Nothing more, sir, Stanley replied. The ship that attacked us after the destruction of the UFS Brennan has also disappeared. It should be an advanced alien species that we have never encountered before, Sheldon highlighted. Your destroyer is the only one I have contact with so far out in space. I'm trying to get a group of junior officers to take charge of Armstrong Station as soon as possible. Until then, I need you to stay alert and keep scanning the region of space for any activity. Acknowledged, sir, Stanley said. Sheldon powered off the holoscreen and folded his arms. Armstrong Station was the primary orbital defense around Euphra, but he needed to give Lieutenant Diaz sufficient time to assemble the people on the station. Meanwhile, Sheldon hoped that Captain Stanley was everything Admiral Harris had said he was. With no other destroyers reporting in, Stanley's UFS Intrepid was the last line of defense in space for now. Chapter 14. Captain's Ready Room, UFS Intrepid. Stanley stared at the blank holoscreen. He was still trying to process what Admiral Sheldon had shared with him. Admiral Harris was dead. Sheldon hadn't come out and directly say it, but there was no need to in such circumstances. Stanley closed his eyes. Harris had been like a mentor to him. A second father after his own one had died right after Stanley had been born. Stanley had never experienced a father growing up. The closest he had come to was when he had taken Admiral Harris's class during his days in the academy. Stanley had considered himself lucky to have gotten into the class. There had been a bidding system for Admiral Harris's class. The need for the bidding system was because Harris's class was amongst the most popular in the entire academy. Many of his seniors had said that if there was one class to take, it had to be Admiral Harris's class on the subtle art of warfare combat. Sitting in his class had been an experience he would never forget. Admiral Harris had come across as a genuine person who exhibited a lot of warmth for the people under his charge. His people skills had been exemplary. Then, Stanley had gotten the double honor of Admiral Harris's attention. For whatever reason, that to this day Stanley never understood, Harris had picked him to be the class representative. That had been a precursor to a wonderful connection with the Admiral that had grown in leaps and bounds over the years. Stanley buried his head in his hands. He couldn't believe Admiral Harris was gone. The last conversation had been all about the UFS Intrepid and his need to prove his critics wrong. Stanley looked up and stared at his ready room. He would ensure that he would keep his word to Admiral Harris. The alien species who did this would pay. Stanley felt an anger rising in him, but he knew he had to keep his emotions in check. He clicked on the holoscreen and swiped it to bring up a map of the region of the space they were currently in. He had asked his XO to maintain their position until he decided their next course of action. It was pointless to head back to Euphra, not after everything that had happened. The oval-shaped alien vessel couldn't have simply disappeared. It still had to be in the Vonia system. It must have gone somewhere. Was it heading to Euphra to collect those aliens who had killed Admiral Harris on board Armstrong Station? That was one possibility. But, according to Admiral Sheldon, it seemed like everything was getting under control on the space station. Admiral Sheldon hadn't given him any explicit instructions. He had hoped Sheldon would recommend his next course of action. But he hadn't, which wasn't surprising, as Sheldon wasn't as experienced as Admiral Harris. The alien species as part of the attack had struck down the right admiral. If the alien species knew of that, they would have been rejoicing. A buzz interrupted his thoughts. It was Commander Mendez. Yes, Commander, Stanley asked. Captain, we did a sweep of the region of space. the XO announced. However, we found nothing of significance, no contacts, no unusual readings, nothing. How about Lonoa 1 and 2? Stanley asked. Euphra had 2 moons, Lonoa 1 and 2. Both were uninhabited. There had been talk of plans by the UFS to establish bases on both moons in the near future, but for whatever reason, those plans hadn't materialized yet. Stanley suspected it had to do with the UFS's limited resources, especially when a lot of it had been reallocated to building a new class of destroyers. We haven't checked to that extent, the XO replied. If there was one thing he had learned from Admiral Harris's class, it was the need to be proactive in the midst of war, and not simply sit idly around waiting for the enemy to make the next move. Stanley knew that he needed to do something. Waiting for Sheldon's next command was dangerous. If Admiral Sheldon was the only high-ranking person left at UFS Central Command, he was worried. Admiral Harris had repeatedly spoken to him about Sheldon's lack of experience, which made him ineffective to lead and wage war. Put in a route to Lonoa 1, Stanley said. Yes, Captain, the XO said. It was time to find that oval-shaped alien ship. Stanley knew in his gut that it was out there. Chapter 15. Underground Bunker, Euphra Shipyards. Admiral, there's a request for entry into the bunker, Lieutenant Storen said. From who? Sheldon growled. Thinking of the situation had begun to eat away at Sheldon. Staying hidden in this underground bunker wasn't the solution. He needed to act and act fast. Captain Peters, sir, Storen replied. Let him in then, Sheldon barked. Storen went to another console and pressed on a panel. There was a click as the door to the bunker opened. Peters slipped in, shutting the door behind. Captain, I hope you have news to report to me, Sheldon said. Peters shared with him on the black powder, the video recording device, and the discovery of the distortion. Sheldon eyed him. Are you telling me this distortion is the same as the one that was reported in space by the UFS Intrepid? Yes, Admiral, Peters replied. Sheldon suspected Peters had already discussed the video footage with his father, General Myers, and it must have been Myers who made the connection. Peters paused for a bit. General Myers also concurred with the assessment. He had been right. The father-son duo had been talking. He closed his eyes briefly. Sheldon knew he needed to focus and not care about Myers. Lieutenant, send a transmission to Captain Stanley immediately on the connection of the distortions, Sheldon ordered. This information might help him out there. Acknowledged, Storen replied. What's Captain Stanley doing? Peters asked. Investigating the presence of that enemy ship, Sheldon commented. That was a lie. Sheldon hadn't given Stanley any direct orders on what to do next. It had been intentional, although Stanley might think Sheldon forgot about it. In actuality, Sheldon wanted to see if the young captain would be proactive and come up with his own actions. Sir, I don't think, Peters began. Sheldon interrupted him. I know, Captain. I'm quite aware that if the alien species went after all my commanders and other admirals, they will not stop coming after me. Despite their failed attempt to infiltrate the dome, the alien species will try again. Yes, sir, Peters agreed. It's too dangerous for you to stay in this bunker. If the aliens wanted to launch the equivalent of a nuke at this dome, none of us would survive it. I also feel that for those 2 aliens to disappear, there must have been an alien ship nearby, which avoided our detection. That's the most likely scenario. Sheldon was slightly impressed with Captain Peters. Had he thought about this on his own, or was this his father speaking through him? It didn't matter. The young Marine captain was right. If there was an alien vessel out there, the danger was high. The aliens would probably still know he was hunkered down somewhere inside the dome. What about those commanders on shore leave? Storen inquired. We cannot leave them be. They don't even know what's happening. Sheldon looked at Storen. You can consider them as already dead. The alien species would ensure that. We don't have the resources to find them and time's running out. Then he turned to Peters. I hope you're not suggesting we simply walk out of this bunker. I doubt your Marine unit can protect me. What's to stop an alien sniper from blowing my head off? Peters shook his head. I have a better idea. It might just work. As Peters explained it, a small smile raced out of the corners of Sheldon's mouth. Chapter 16. Bridge, UFS Intrepid. It had been a little while since the UFS Intrepid had begun moving towards Lonoa 1. Stanley wasn't sure if this was the right course of action, but he had to follow his feeling in his gut. One thing that had kept bothering him was how the alien species were able to get to Armstrong Station and the Euphra shipyards with relative ease. It appeared they had to be staging these clandestine attacks from somewhere. The moons of Euphra could be one possible base from which an alien species could launch an attack. They were the next nearest land masses to Euphra in space. Then, Commander Mendez turned to him. His face was pale. Captain, I just went through the manifest of the UFS Brennan, the XO announced. And? Stanley asked. Couldn't his XO get to the point quickly? He didn't have the time for the long-winded way he liked to talk. I should have checked on it earlier, but I didn't, the XO continued. Lieutenant Torrey is listed in the crew manifest. The problem is that the lieutenant is listed as a male, not a female. Stanley needed to be certain. Is there any other Lieutenant Torrey on board the UFS Brennan? Did you check the entire crew manifest? Mendez had already made a mistake. Stanley didn't want to compound it by wrongly accusing Lieutenant Torrey on board their vessel. That would further increase the tension aboard his ship. Yes, Captain, the XO replied. I've scanned the entire list. Stanley took a deep breath and stood up. Where is the imposter Lieutenant Torrey right now? I'm checking, sir, the XO said. Stanley became impatient. I need the information now. The imposter Lieutenant Torrey should be at the Deck 1 compartment, the XO replied. His XO was making an assumption that the imposter would remain in the compartment. Stanley doubted it. Commander Mendes, you have the bridge, Stanley said. Sir, I should go instead, Mendes insisted. This was my mistake. Let me fix it. Commander Mendes, I need you here on the bridge, Stanley ordered. Find me a way to track whoever that imposter is. I believe it should be one of the alien species. There must be something unusual in the alien that allows us to track it. Shall I raise the alert? The XO asked. Stanley's reply was firm. No, and no one on the bridge is to communicate otherwise. Is that clear? He glanced around the bridge. Everyone gave a cursory nod. He wanted to keep the element of surprise with him. His XO had made a serious mistake, but Stanley realized that as captain, he had permitted it. The sole survivor had been planted as an elaborate trap by the alien species, and they had walked right into it. They had allowed an alien presence on board the UFS Intrepid. He should have asked the XO to do a scan of the survivor. He recalled the imposter Lieutenant Torrey even refusing to have a medical checkup at sickbay. That should have been a clue that something was wrong. However, Stanley had failed to pick up on it. He couldn't believe what he had allowed. Was this how the UFS Brennan had been compromised? He really hoped not. Stanley motioned to another junior officer. Lieutenant Tyson, you're with me. The junior officer nearest the right side of the bridge stood up and walked to his side as Stanley left the bridge. Chapter 17, Deck 1, UFS Intrepid. As Stanley stepped off the lift, he tightened his grip on his weapon. As a new captain, he wasn't going to allow this alien to sabotage his vessel. It now made sense to him. The presence of the alien had been the reason why the oval-shaped alien vessel had stayed back and destroyed the UFS Brennan. It had been a way for the alien species to keep them distracted from the real threat on board the UFS Intrepid. Stanley didn't want to imagine what the alien had been up to during his short stay on board his vessel. He was angry with himself for not recognizing the trap. He couldn't believe that he had sat and talked with the alien alone in a briefing room. Stanley grimaced as he tried to go through the different scenarios in his mind. The junior officer standing beside him on the Deck 1 corridor had his weapon out, but was looking at the ground. Lieutenant Tyson, is this your first real combat experience? Stanley asked. Tyson looked up at him and nodded. Yes, Captain. There's nothing to it, Stanley said. Follow my instructions and we will both be fine. Stanley made a promise to a junior officer that he himself didn't know if he could keep, but he had to encourage the junior officer. While the UFS had been created to defend humanity on Euphra, it had never been put to the test until this situation. Stanley knew they were dealing with a deadly alien species. Their ability to take out Admiral Harris and other commanders at will meant he couldn't take them for granted. Despite that, he didn't want to march into the compartment with an entire unit of guards. He needed the alien alive so he could try to find out what was going on. As they walked along the corridor, Stanley spoke into the ear-comms unit. Mendes, have you found a way to track this thing? Sir, I'm trying to, Mendes' voice trailed off. I don't need to know what you're trying, Stanley whispered. I only need what works and I need it now. Acknowledged, Mendes replied. Commander, ask engineering and weapons to secure themselves immediately, Stanley ordered. Only indicate there is a potential threat. Stanley didn't know what was the objective of the alien coming on board the UFS Intrepid. If it had been to kill him, the alien would have done it already when he had met with the thing in the briefing room. By its actions, it didn't seem to want to kill him. That meant there was something else the alien wanted. Yes, Captain, the XO replied. Stanley approached the compartment door with Tyson beside him. Fortunately, there was no one outside the area of the compartment door. Once they reached the compartment door, he motioned for Tyson to stand on the other side. Tyson took his position and at Stanley's signal pressed on the override panel. The door slid open and they stepped in with their weapons leveled ahead of them. The compartment was empty. Stanley motioned for Tyson to check the compartment. The junior officer swiftly moved around the room but signaled that no one was present. Stanley bit his lip. He had been correct about the fact that the imposter Lieutenant Torrey wouldn't simply stay in the designated compartment. Captain, it must be outside but close by, Tyson highlighted. That certainly was a possibility. With engineering and weapons isolated, there was no chance of the imposter making its way into those areas of the UFS Intrepid. How far is the mess hall on Deck 1, Stanley asked as they stepped back into the corridor. Tyson pointed ahead. It's just around the corner, Captain. Stanley began to walk in that direction. The mess hall would be the next logical place where the imposter Lieutenant Torrey could have gone to. As they approached the corner, the imposter Lieutenant Torrey appeared with another female officer beside her. The imposter Lieutenant Torrey was smiling. The moment its eyes saw them in the distance, everything changed. Stanley realized it must have been the weapon in his hand. In his haste to get to the mess hall, he had forgotten to hide it, but there was nothing he could do about it. The imposter Lieutenant Torrey stopped smiling, turned to the female officer, grabbed her by the neck and pulled out the weapon from her holster. The female officer tried to shout but softened down when Stanley approached him. Lieutenant Torrey, let her go, Stanley asked. The imposter Lieutenant Torrey's face contorted. Stanley caught a glimpse of a different face. It wasn't human, and it had a sinister shade of blue. Captain, we both know I'm not Lieutenant Torrey, the imposter Lieutenant Torrey hissed. I hadn't expected you to detect my presence so soon. I'm impressed by your capabilities. Stanley didn't understand how the alien had taken over a human body. Somehow the human body of Lieutenant Torrey had become the host of the alien, but the alien had made a mistake by picking the wrong name for the body. That doesn't matter, Stanley said. What do you want with us? Why did you come on board? The imposter Lieutenant Torrey fired his weapon at the floor. Do not come any closer. If you do, I will rip her neck off. Stanley stopped in his tracks and eyed the imposter Lieutenant Torrey. Who are you? We are the Rukli, the imposter Lieutenant Torrey replied. What do you want? Stanley repeated. You are trespassing on our part of space, the Rukli alien sneered. Stanley assumed the alien was talking about Euphra. Humanity had arrived on Euphra many years ago. He also couldn't remember the exact date. We've been here for years, Stanley said. I don't know what you're talking about. You lie, the Rukli alien hissed. Stanley knew it was too dangerous to be talking to this alien out here in the open. Something needed to be done. Why don't you let the woman go and we can talk, Stanley said. There's nothing to talk about, the Rukli alien retorted. Your species must leave this region of space. As I told you before, we are not. Stanley's voice trailed off. The Rukli alien threw the female officer at them, turned and ran down the corridor. Tyson managed to catch the female officer and break her fall. Check on her, Stanley said as he ran in pursuit of the Rukli alien. Chapter 18, Bridge, UFS Winston. Admiral Sheldon glanced around at the crew on the bridge. He had been astonished by the speed with which Lieutenant Storen had been able to find sufficient people from the Euphra shipyards on such short notice. It appeared that Admiral Harris had been able to pull in many more resources than expected into the shipyards. Harris must have had the foresight that a lot of these new destroyers would be commissioned soon. Sheldon had to admit Harris had been a planning genius when it came to his Trebium mineral project. Captain Peters turned to him. Sir, I think we have enough people to get this vessel underway. Peters didn't understand how many UFS crew were needed to run a destroyer. And this wasn't just another destroyer. It was the second of a new breed of destroyers. To many of the makeshift crew, this destroyer and its capabilities would be foreign to them. Most of them would haven't had the sufficient hours of training on such a vessel. Sheldon knew he was asking the crew to fly by the seat of their pants. Captain Stanley was the only other person with such a vessel in space. And Sheldon recalled that Harris had transferred experienced crew into some of the critical positions of the UFS Intrepid. Despite his reservations with the Marine captain's plan, Sheldon had given the green light to go ahead with it. Peters must have assessed that moving him on ground or even in a combat shuttle was too dangerous. A destroyer provided much more protection. Sheldon had to trust Peters on his judgment. There had still been no sign of the two aliens who had tried to infiltrate the dome. Sheldon had to admit that the plan proposed by Peters had been a bold and daring one. It would be something the enemy would have not anticipated. If the alien species was still waiting for him outside the dome, they would be taken by surprise when the UFS Winston left the shipyard. He wondered if Peters had run his plan by General Myers, but he dared not ask. Even if he had, it didn't matter. The plan had a good chance of success. Lieutenant, have you got the people we need in place? Sheldon asked. Admiral, we got the crew for engineering, weapons, and other key departments, Doran reported. The bridge is at your command. Sheldon had been fortunate that the UFS Winston had passed all of its checks last week, which was the final step before it could be formally commissioned. That had made the decision of which destroyer to pick in the shipyards much easier. All that had been missing last week was a new captain and crew. The vessel didn't have a new captain. That could wait. But Storen had been able to muster together a crew. The reality that the crew wasn't experienced was further compounded by the fact that he himself had never been a captain of a vessel. He had been promoted due to his other capabilities, and his promotions had been by necessity, which Sheldon had no regrets over. He wasn't sure if Peters was privy to this confidential information through General Myers. He chose to ignore such matters as they had more pressing issues in front of them. Peters turned to him. Admiral, my units are all on board. We transferred all the necessary weapons from our combat shuttle and are ready. I guess you're going to have to lead this vessel. Sheldon didn't flinch at the suggestion. He had no intention of sitting in the captain's chair. This wasn't his vessel. He needed a suitable temporary person to lead the vessel. Fortunately, he had Storen with him. "Lieutenant, let's get underway," Sheldon ordered, motioning to the captain's chair. "And you better take a seat there." Storen initially hesitated, but reluctantly went and sat down in the captain's chair. He was uncomfortable as anyone would have been to sit on the chair, but these were unusual times which required a break in protocols. "Yes, sir," Storen said. "But where are we heading to?" "Take us into orbit," Sheldon replied. Peters looked surprised by his response, but remained quiet. Sheldon knew where he wanted to go, but now wasn't the time to reveal it. Chapter 19. Decks 1 and 2, UFS Intrepid. Stanley raced around another corner of the corridor. Weapons fire kept hitting the walls of the corridor. He ducked and rolled on the ground as he turned the corner. He was glad there were no other crew in the vicinity. The corridor ended at a lift. He got himself up and ran to the lift. He was too late. The Rookley alien sneered at him from within the lift as he went up to the next level. Stanley grimaced. "Commander Mendez, the alien is going up to deck 2. Ask the guards to get over there now. But do not shoot to kill. I want the alien alive." "Yes, Captain," the XO replied. He knew he couldn't wait for the lift. Stanley opened the door on the right side of the lift. He stepped inside and opened a panel in the wall. There was a ladder. He began climbing the steps of the ladder. He still couldn't understand what the Rookley alien wanted from them. Obviously, there had been a reason for the Rookley to send a spy into the UFS Intrepid. Capturing the Rookley alien would help find answers to these questions and more. Once he reached deck 2, he opened the panel and got off the ladder and crawled out into another room. He pulled out his weapon and leveled it at the door as he slowly opened it. Stanley heard weapons fire from further down the corridor. His crew must have engaged with the Rookley alien. He slipped out of the room. The lift was to his right. It was empty. The sound of weapons fire continued on. Mendez's voice broke through his thoughts. "Captain, I found a way to track the alien. The alien displays a different vital sign of that of us. It's faint, but I adjusted the ship's sensor and tested it out." Stanley had doubts with his XO. "How accurate is the modified sensor?" "About 80%, the XO replied. Stanley took his chances with the modified sensor. "How far ahead of me is the alien?" 100 meters, sir. And it is moving away slowly." "Can you project where the alien is heading to?" Stanley asked. "Engineering," his XO replied. Stanley bit his lip. That was the last place he wanted the Rookley alien to head towards. "Inform engineering that no matter what happens, they must remain inside. Even if they hear my voice, they shouldn't open the doors." "Acknowledged, Captain," the XO replied. He had no idea what the Rookley alien wanted with engineering. It was possible the alien wanted to disrupt the ship's reactors, but he was going to make sure there would be no way for the alien to get into that part of the vessel. If they had to kill the Rookley alien before it reached engineering, he would do it. "Get another guard unit down here outside of engineering," Stanley ordered. "They're already on the way," his XO said. Stanley was glad to have an experienced XO on board. Mendez was thinking on the run. Stanley kept moving forward until, according to his XO's modified sensors, he was about 50 meters away from the alien. "Captain, you are now less than 30 meters from it," the XO murmured. Stanley suspected the fighting was going on around the next corner. He heard some muffled sounds. Then there was silence. Stanley leveled his weapon forward as he rounded the corner. Stanley swallowed hard. The scene in front of him was horrendous. 3 bodies of his crew were strewn across the floor. Stanley didn't have to check on their vital signs. They were dead. There were multiple wounds over their bodies. His eyes looked ahead. The Rookley alien was standing at the door to engineering. Stanley tiptoed around his dead crew as he inched forward. The Rookley alien was kneeling on the floor and trying to short-circuit the panel to get access into engineering. It seemed to be solely focused on the panel next to the door. Stanley was surprised to see the weapon the Rookley alien used on the floor. Stanley aimed his weapon and fired it at the Rookley alien's weapon on the floor. The weapon burst into flames as the Rookley alien turned towards him. "You are a persistent species," the Rookley alien scowled. "There's no way out of here," Stanley shouted. "More of my crew are on the way." The Rookley alien laughed. "Captain, you don't know who you're dealing with. There's always a way for the Rookley. We do not adhere to your physical constraints." Then an alien figure stepped out of the lieutenant's body, after which the body dissolved away, right in front of Stanley's eyes. The disintegration of the human body shook him. He took a step back as he saw for the first time the Rookley alien. It was a humanoid figure with 2 hands shaped into 2 sharp cone-like edges. It didn't have any fingers. Its face was composed of 3 black holes for his pair of eyes and a mouth. The Rookley alien moved its cone-like edged hands in his direction. Stanley realized one brush with those hands could easily pierce his body and kill him instantly. Stanley heard the shuffling of feet behind him. He briefly glanced back. 5 of his crew were standing with their weapons aimed ahead of them. "You will not be able to stop all of us," the Rookley alien shouted as he ran towards them, waving its cone-like edged hands. "Fire to kill," Stanley bellowed. The barrage of weapons fire was loud, and the Rookley alien collapsed before it had even covered half the distance towards them. There was black blood oozing out of the Rookley alien's lifeless body. An acidic-like smell reached Stanley's nostrils. He stepped away, covered his nose, because he didn't like the smell of the alien blood. Stanley motioned to his men. No one should touch it until you get yourself into suits. Seal off this area. Inform engineering to remain inside. Once you are in your suits, take the body to the sickbay for analysis. Get a few more crew to ensure your path to sickbay is clear. I don't want you running into any of our crew with that thing in your hands. Yes, Captain, one of the guards replied. Stanley spoke into his comms link. Commander, inform the chief medical officer we are sending over a body that may be toxic. He needs to be careful with it. Acknowledge, the XO said. Chapter 20. Bridge, UFS Intrepid. Stanley walked onto the bridge and sat at his chair. He was still mulling over his encounter with the Rookley alien. He then turned to his XO. Good work on tracking the alien. Mendes nodded. Sir, I would like to submit my resignation. For what? Stanley asked in disbelief. I shouldn't have brought the alien on board our vessel, the XO whispered. It was a mistake, Stanley said. And I am part of that mistake. Sir, I was in charge of the boarding party that went on to the UFS Brennan. Mendes continued. Crew members are dead because of my serious mistake, sir. Please accept my resignation. I don't accept your resignation, Stanley replied softly, mindful not to allow the rest of the bridge crew to listen in on their conversation. But sir, the XO's voice trailed off. Without trying to attract too much attention, Stanley raised his hand at his XO. Commander Mendes, I need your experience now more than ever. You have the most experience of any crew member aboard the UFS Intrepid. If it weren't for your experience, we would have never been able to track the alien on board the ship. That alone helped us corner the alien and kill it. I need you to stay at your post. After all this is over, you can consider whether you want to leave or not, although I would prefer you to stay. Mendes nodded reluctantly. Yes, Captain. Stanley was glad that was over. He didn't have the luxury of losing his XO at this critical time. He hated to admit that the mistake was a serious one, and several crew members had died because of it. He also didn't like the fact that he had casualties during his watch. However, this had been their first experience with a hostile alien species, and they were not yet out of danger, not by a long shot. I have a name for the alien species, Stanley said. When it talked to me, it referred to itself as the Rookley. Can you check our Euphra net if there's any reference to such a species? Stanley realized this was the very first contact of an alien species ever since Euphra had been established by humanity. He recalled that in the years after colonization, people had expected to run into many different alien species. But over time, people had gotten used to the reality that they were possibly alone in the Vonia system. Mendes turned back to his console. We don't have any reference to Rookley in the system, sir. That was what Stanley had feared. He had expected it, but had held out some hope that maybe humanity had encountered this species before. They were up against a new deadly enemy whose capabilities were still unknown. How did you find a way to track the Rookley? Stanley asked. I recall the distortion we had seen on the UFS Brennan, the XO replied, and I thought it might be something unique to the alien. It turned out that when the alien was on the move, there was a distortion. It wasn't as strong as the one we observed on the video footage, but it was present enough to give me a signal. Stanley was impressed with his XO. In the end, he had come through for them. Keep the sensors modified to track such distortions, Stanley said. And can you get the modifications onto our sensor devices so that we can track them on the move? The XO nodded. Stanley knew they were going to encounter more of these Rookley aliens sooner or later. It was best to be ready. The ability to track the alien using a distortion was their best bet for now. Captain, we are reaching Lenoa 1, the navigations officer announced. Stanley shifted in his chair as he turned his attention to the view screen. The bluish moon of Lenoa 1 came into view as the UFS Intrepid moved into orbit. Sweep the area, Stanley ordered. Yes, Captain, the sensor officer replied. Sir, we are picking up. We have a contact, the XO interrupted. Stanley looked at the display in front of him. A red icon was moving rapidly towards them. Identification, Stanley asked. It's similar to the oval-shaped alien ship, but not the exact one, the XO replied. If it wasn't the same alien ship, it meant there were multiple alien ships roaming about. Could this be part of their attack, or were these vessels part of some recon force? How long before the ship is in weapons range? Stanley asked. 2 minutes, sir. Prepare to engage, Stanley ordered. Acknowledge, the tactical officer said. Stanley turned to the XO. It's possible they are hiding something on Lenoa 1 and they do not want us to find it. Mendes nodded. I agree, Captain. Stanley recalled that their last encounter with the other oval-shaped alien ship had ended with the ship disappearing on them. Would that scenario repeat itself? Sir, they are firing on us, the sensor officer shouted. Chapter 21. Captain's Ready Room, UFS Winston. As the UFS Winston raced towards orbit, Admiral Sheldon took a seat in the chair behind the desk. He felt more at ease seated here outside the purview of the bridge crew. He was glad that Storen had never asked him why he hadn't taken the captain's chair on the bridge. Peters had also not objected to it, which hopefully settled the matter. Sheldon brought up the display. It would be a matter of minutes before the vessel reached orbit. They had been fortunate not to encounter any vessels on the way up through the atmosphere. Although Storen's makeshift crew included a tactical officer, Sheldon was doubtful he would be as experienced as needed to be on such a destroyer. Despite that, Sheldon had ordered Storen to get the bridge crew trained as much as possible on the capabilities of the destroyer. There was a buzz at the door. "You may enter," Sheldon hollered. The door opened and Peters walked in. "Take a seat, Captain," Sheldon gestured. "Admiral, we should be reaching orbit soon," Peters announced. Sheldon nodded. That wasn't news to him, and it couldn't be the only reason that Peters had chosen to come to him. There was more. "Sir, there was a reason I chose to use this vessel," Peters said. Sheldon stared at him. "Go on." "I believe there's a reason that Captain Stanley was never killed by the aliens," Peters commented. "And what reason would that be?" Sheldon asked. Was this Peters or his father, General Myers, talking? Sheldon was unable to distinguish between the two of them. There were some similarities between General Myers and his youngest son, but Sheldon also realized that Peters was his own man. Despite that, both men were thinkers. He could see it in Peters' eyes. "I think it has to do with the Trebium that was used to build the UFS Intrepid," Peters replied. "This vessel also has the same Trebium as part of its exterior." Sheldon narrowed his eyes. "I see where you're going with this, Captain. But what about me? Why was I spared? I wasn't in any of those vessels when the aliens attacked us, because the exterior of the dome at Euphra shipyards also has the same Trebium," Peters said. "I only realized it a bit later when I was researching my theory." Peters was clever to discover a potential connection. No one at UFS Central Command had yet even made any suggestions to him. He would have expected a few officers down there to figure out what was going on and update him, but it hadn't happened. The lack of experience at UFS Central Command was something he would need to fix if they got out of this situation alive. "Sir, did you get what I mean?" Peters asked. Sheldon woke up from his thoughts and nodded. Peters would be a fine leader one day for the Euphra Defense Forces, just like his father, General Myers. It probably ran in the blood. Sheldon, having no children, had a tinge of envy as these thoughts ran through his mind. "How sure can we be of this theory of yours?" Sheldon inquired. To begin with, the Trebium mineral project was something Sheldon had never been fond of, and the Marine captain's claim that the mineral itself had saved his life sounded incredible. Sheldon knew he would need irrefutable proof before he would believe it. He couldn't risk the lives of his people without it. Too many lives had already been lost. "Sure of what, sir?" Peters asked. "Of whether the aliens are really unable to penetrate the Trebium exterior," Sheldon said. "That's probably why the aliens struggled to penetrate the dome," Peters insisted. "It seems to make sense." Sheldon frowned. "I need you to find a way to prove it." Peters stood up. "I'll work on it. By the way, what happens when you get to orbit?" "I'm going to direct us to dock at Armstrong Station," Sheldon stated. "Permission to speak freely, sir," Peters said. "Go ahead," Sheldon said. "Armstrong Station isn't lined with Trebium," Peters said. "That was why the aliens most likely were able to penetrate its defenses and kill Admiral Harris and the other commanders. If my theory is correct, we could be walking into a trap." "I note your concerns, Captain, but unless you can prove this theory of yours, we are proceeding to the station." Chapter 22. Bridge, UFS Intrepid. "What's the status?" Stanley asked. "Shields are holding stir," the tactical officer replied. "We have started firing at them." The slugs of the mag rail guns streaked towards the alien vessel, but nothing happened. There was no explosion of any kind. "Did we hit it?" the XO asked. "I don't think so," the tactical officer replied. "What do you mean you don't think so?" the XO shouted. "Find out and tell me." The tactical officer's body stiffened as he leaned forward to study his console. Stanley pulled up his display. The path of the weapons fire should have culminated in a direct hit on the alien vessel. "Captain, our weapons fire never reached them," the tactical officer indicated. "They were neutralized." "How?" Stanley asked. "Still checking, sir," the tactical officer replied. "Captain, more enemy fire on the way," the sensor officer stated. Stanley braced for a hit, but nothing materialized. "What happened? Did they miss us?" The tactical officer turned to him. "Captain, their recent weapons fire had no effect on us." "That was impossible." Mendes scratched his head. "Our shields are still at 100%. I don't get it. The weapons fire came directly at us. There's no way it could have missed our vessel, unless the aliens were poor aim." However, that didn't seem likely. Nothing he had encountered so far about the Rookly aliens supported that premise. "More weapons fire incoming," the sensor officer reported. "Keep firing at them," Stanley barked. He felt the ship begin to turn to the starboard side. "Captain, I don't think our weapons are having any effect on them," the tactical officer said. "Then find me another solution quickly," Stanley highlighted. Stanley didn't need to know what wasn't working. He needed quick solutions. His tactical officer had been on board another destroyer before he was posted to the UFS Intrepid. Stanley expected more of him. "The alien vessel is moving closer," the sensor officer reported. "Move us away from it," Stanley directed. "If their weapons fire fire had no effect on the alien vessel, there was no need for them to be in weapons range. It was also strange as to why the alien vessel kept moving closer. Captain, I noticed a slight drop in the power to the shields, Mendez reported. Stanley frowned. How slight? We had a 1% drop, the XO replied. Wait, the power to the shields has now dropped by another 2%. Stanley looked back at the view screen. Something was wrong. The alien vessel couldn't have intentionally missed them, and he felt the alien vessel moving closer was somehow linked to the power drop in the shields. It then dawned on him what was happening. Move us out of weapons range of the alien vessel immediately, Stanley ordered. Chapter 23, Deck 1, Mess Hall, UFS Winston. Peters walked into the mess hall. Lieutenant Cruz waved to him from one corner. As he strolled towards the table, Cruz stood up. At ease, Peters said as he took a seat opposite her. Cruz sat down and looked at him. Captain, how did it go? Peters had briefed his lieutenant that he was going to meet Admiral Sheldon to discuss his theory about the Trebium being a shield against the aliens. He hadn't even had time to check in with General Myers on it. Instead, he had decided to propose his theory first. Admiral Sheldon wasn't convinced, Peters highlighted. He doesn't believe in the connection to the Trebium. The UFS Winston is still on its way to the station. Peters had to give Sheldon the benefit of the doubt. Being the last UFS admiral standing, Sheldon was being cautious. Peters realized the admiral wouldn't want to take any unnecessary risk after having accumulated so many losses. But you know what that means, right? Cruz asked. Lieutenant, I'm aware of the implication, Peters scoffed. Cruz wasn't the only one who understood the implication of docking at Armstrong Station. Peters expected every member of his unit to be thinking and even discussing it amongst themselves. Once they docked, his Marine unit would be the first to go through the airlock. That was the standard protocol. They were the first in and last out. All their training had prepared them for such a scenario. Cruz frowned. We have no clue of what to expect on board that space station. They might take us all out before we even fire a single shot. Peters was surprised by Cruz's worries. She had never demonstrated any such fear during the training exercises. Despite that, Peters knew his lieutenant was reliable. She came from a long line of Marines. Are you afraid, Lieutenant? Peters asked. Is that what I'm hearing from you? Cruz smiled. Captain, you don't even need to ask that question. I will be at the front when we go through that airlock. The aliens may also no longer be on the station, Peters remarked. I heard from Storen that they are in contact with a Lieutenant Diaz, who is now in charge of Armstrong Station. The fact that they are still alive on the station is a good sign. Cruz's eyes widened. Are you saying that a lieutenant is in charge of the entire station? That's how dangerous the situation is, Peters admitted. She is the highest ranking member on that station. Cruz remained silent. The aliens may not engage us, Peters mused. For whatever reason, they didn't engage us at the Euphra shipyards. It was something that continued to bother Peters. He had expected the two figures to return fire and attack them outside the dome, but it hadn't happened. The decision by the aliens to run away was concerning. He also suspected they may have had a ship nearby to disappear onto, but he didn't understand how the aliens had accomplished it without their detection. Captain, what are you thinking? Cruz asked, interrupting his thoughts. The fact the aliens never engaged us at the shipyards means something. I think they are like a small early attack force that is also doing some recon. But if that is the case, they need to be staging this early attack from somewhere, Cruz said. If their ships were in orbit around Euphra, sooner or later we would have detected them. That was the question that Peters had no answer to, at least not yet. Chapter 24, Bridge, UFS Intrepid. The moment the navigation officer had begun to move their vessel back, the alien ship had begun to accelerate towards them. Captain, the sensor officer's voice trailed off. Fire the missiles at them, Stanley ordered. Fired away, the tactical officer replied. The contrails of multiple missiles streaked across the view screen. The alien vessel fired a beam against the missiles. The beam destroyed two of the missiles. The alien vessel is taking evasive action, the tactical officer announced. It's causing them to slow down. Stanley bit his lip. The alien vessel wasn't able to deter away all of their missiles. Stanley made a mental note of it. There had to be something there that they could use for future engagements. We're finally getting them, the XO shouted. Stanley didn't want everyone to lose sight of the fact that they were still in a battle with an unknown but deadly enemy. Update me on the enemy vessel status, Stanley asked. The alien ship has slowed down and is holding its position, the sensor officer reported. Did any of our missiles hit their target? Stanley asked. The tactical officer shook his head. Negative, Captain. Stanley couldn't believe it. Although the aliens' beam had managed to get to a few of their missiles, the rest should have hit the enemy ship. It couldn't be possible that both the mag rail guns and missiles had no effect on the alien vessel. Stanley looked at his XO. What do you think is going on? The XO grimaced. I think the missile launch took them by surprise and they were forced to evade it. But as to why the alien vessel didn't sustain any impact is confusing. Captain, the alien vessel has disappeared, the sensor officer said. Stanley clenched his fists. What were the Rukli ships up to? Why had the Rukli vessel chosen to disappear? It was as if they were doing a recon of the area. I think it's clear they were hiding around Lenovo 1, sir, the XO commented. Stanley agreed. Lenovo 1 could be a staging base for them. How long had the Rookley been there? At the moment, that was anyone's guess. The UFS had always sent patrols to this part of space. However, no one had ever reported any encounters with such enemy vessels. He wished he had Admiral Harris to talk to about this. Admiral Harris always made the time for him. Stanley looked away as he thought about Admiral Harris's death. If the Rookley aliens were behind his death, they would pay for it. The XO turned to him. Captain, what about the power drop to the shields? Stanley shared his thoughts. I think the Rookley have a weapon that can drain the power to our shields. That was why our shields weren't affected by their weapon. Such a weapon that had the capability to drain a ship's power could be dangerous to the UFS and its vessels. Stanley would need to report this back to UFS Central Command. Sir, then we have a bigger problem, the XO declared. Commander, get engineering to restore the power loss to the shields, Stanley ordered. Yes, Captain, the XO replied. Also, please write up a report on our encounter at Lenovo 1, Stanley directed. Send it to me as soon as possible. I need to update the Admiral on it. Stanley hoped Admiral Sheldon and UFS Central Command would have better luck on finding the real purpose of the Rookley aliens. Chapter 25, Captain's Ready Room, UFS Winston. Sheldon stared at the hollow screen. He had just finished talking with Lieutenant Diaz at Armstrong Station. He was impressed with the resourcefulness of Diaz. She had been able to get everyone remaining on the station organized into 2 units. There were now 2 other junior lieutenants manning the operations center on the station. Sheldon hadn't questioned the selection process nor the experience of either of the junior lieutenants. He didn't have the luxury of doing that and would have to trust Diaz's abilities. He also didn't want to put further pressure on Diaz as she would already have her hands full with everything else on the station. Diaz had also updated him that she had gotten officers stationed at the weapons workstations. Sheldon felt reassured by that proactive effort by Diaz. He had been a member of the committee that had helped establish Armstrong Station several years ago. He recalled that the circular station was configured with multiple turrets along the perimeter to fend off any attacks. Aside from those turrets, the space station was deployed with groups of point defense cannons. At the time of planning for the station, there had been critics who had questioned a need for such weaponry. However, Sheldon and Harris had been able to convince them that the weaponry would ensure Armstrong Station would become Euphra's formidable orbital defense. It was one of those moments where he had seen eye to eye with Admiral Harris. Looking back, Sheldon felt relieved that they had pushed for such weaponry on the station. A buzz broke him from his thoughts. The holoscreen flickered on. It was Lieutenant Stoddard from the bridge. Admiral, we are docking with Armstrong Station now, Stoddard reported. Acknowledged, Sheldon said. Order Captain Peters and his unit to be on standby at the airlock. Yes, Admiral, Stoddard said. Peters had shown some reluctance to go on board Armstrong Station. Sheldon had to admit that he had been surprised by it. He would have expected it from anyone else except Peters. Despite that, Peters was a soldier first and would follow his orders. Initially, Sheldon had refused to even consider his theory about the Trebium and its link to both his safety and that of Captain Stanley on board the UFS Intrepid. However, after Peters had left his ready room, Sheldon had begun to consider the Marine captain's theory from the different angles. It wasn't as far-fetched as he had originally thought, and there was still the factor that Peters was the son of humanity's most honored general. That itself made Sheldon reconsider the Marine captain's theory. Was it possible that the mineral Trebium had saved him? It was true he had been inside the dome when the coordinated attacks by the alien species had occurred. The domes had been part of the initial work under the Trebium mineral project. Admiral Harris had been insistent on using the Trebium to build the dome structure. Many people, including himself, had scoffed at the idea to use Trebium on the dome itself. With the increasing cost of mining the Trebium, it seemed like a waste to use it on the dome structure. However, Harris's foresight may have saved him. There was a buzz on his holoscreen. It was a transmission from Diaz. Sheldon swiped the screen and opened the message. It was a short one. Admiral, we managed to translate the last part of the signal. The complete message says, "They're coming for your Trebium. They're coming for your Trebium." Sheldon stared at the words. Was this a warning? But from who? The very fact that Trebium was part of the message rattled his thoughts. Was this linked to Peters' theory? Stoddard appeared on his holoscreen. Admiral, the docking with Armstrong Station has been completed. Peters and his unit are at the airlock waiting for your instructions to board the station. Sheldon looked again at the warning message. It had to be a warning. Someone was warning them. At this moment, there was no way to determine who it was. But why did the aliens want the Trebium? Sheldon accepted it was an unusual mineral. However, there were many minerals everywhere in the galaxy. What was so special about the Trebium? Stoddard hesitated. Admiral, your orders? Sheldon turned his eyes back to the holoscreen. Lieutenant, order Peters and his unit to stand down and return to their compartments. Aren't we supposed to board the station? Stoddard asked in confusion. No one is to board the station until I say so. Is that clear, Lieutenant? Sheldon asked. Yes, Admiral. Chapter 26, Sickbay, UFS Intrepid. Stanley marched into the sickbay. What's the status on our dead rookie? Prior to his arrival, the chief medical officer had informed him that he didn't need a suit to enter the sickbay. Stanley had been relieved to hear that. Chief Medical Officer Finn smiled. Captain, is that what this alien species is called? That's what it told me before it was taken down, Stanley replied, as he approached the gurney where the alien body or what was left of it lay. Finn was a veteran of space travel. Like his exo, Finn had been posted to several destroyers before being assigned to the UFS Intrepid. Finn was highly regarded, and Stanley always suspected Admiral Harris had pulled some strings to get him on board this vessel. Finn turned to him with a sympathetic look. I heard about Admiral Harris's death. I'm sorry for your loss, sir. Stanley hadn't expected that from his chief medical officer, but he nodded. Finn must have known that Harris had been close to him. Not many people would be aware of it, but Stanley figured Harris may have shared that with the chief medical officer before he was assigned to the UFS Intrepid. Admiral Harris had many good things to say about you, sir, Finn continued as he used his medical equipment on one part of the alien body. Stanley had always suspected that Harris and Finn had been close. Being in the same age group was one key reason, although he didn't know the two of them may have even served together. Finn must have got the signal that he didn't want to talk about Admiral Harris. As you can see here, I have done an autopsy of the alien body. Stanley peered at the body. Is there anything we can learn from it? Finn nodded. First and foremost, do you see that dried black blood which had oozed out of it? Stanley nodded. It is deadly to our skin, Finn revealed. Is it toxic? Stanley asked. If it was, we wouldn't be standing here around the body, Finn smirked. We would be dead. That would be a funny story. The captain and chief medical officer died while inspecting the dead rookie. Stanley took a step back. Chief Medical Officer Finn was known to have an unusual sense of humor. Stanley had encountered it when Finn had reported to duty on the first day at his ready room. Despite that, Stanley liked Finn. He had a certain warmth and genuineness in him that Stanley rarely found amongst his crew. Finn was different from Commander Mendez, and that difference drew Stanley more to Finn rather than anyone else on the UFS Intrepid. I clipped a piece of our skin from one of the dead bodies over there and ran a test on it, Finn said, as he motioned to another corner of the facility. It was only then that Stanley realized there were several more gurneys on the side with white cloth draped over each of them. Stanley sighed. It was his dead crew. They had sacrificed their lives to protect the vessel. His mistake had led to this. Finn must have sensed his thoughts. This isn't your fault. I'm the captain, Stanley said. The responsibility ends with me. Finn nodded reluctantly. Such mistakes won't happen again, Stanley remarked. I had my suspicions which were proven when the black blood burned through the skin like it was nothing, Finn reported. Captain, you should have been here when it happened. It was quite a spectacle. Was that why Lieutenant Torrey's body dissolved the moment the alien left it? Stanley asked. It's a possibility, Finn replied. But I don't think so. I think the dissolving of a human body was something else far more insidious. I cannot be sure without more tests on the black blood itself. Stanley wondered if that was what had happened to Admiral Harris and the commanders on Armstrong Station. He struggled to control his thoughts regarding Admiral Harris. What else did you find? Stanley asked. Finn used an instrument to point at the cone-shaped hands. Those may look unusual, but they are deadly. The tips can penetrate our armor. Stanley took a deep breath. Finn, are you sure? Sure as I've ever been about anything, Finn replied curtly. This rookie species, as you call it, is highly deadly. Their blood eats away at our skin and their hands penetrate armor. Stanley was impressed with Finn's ability to identify the key parts of the alien body. Anything else? Finn smiled. Captain, I will update you if I do find anything else on this body. But as Chief Medical Officer, I advise that you approach these aliens with the greatest caution. Any form of close combat would be deadly to us humans. Stanley bit his lip. The rookie species was going to be a formidable challenge to them. Understood, Stanley said. As Stanley was about to leave, Finn turned to him. I have one more thing I would like to say. Stanley stared at him. Go ahead. This may not be my place to say, but I heard some muttering amongst the crew, Finn announced. You need to keep an eye on it. I understand it's a new crew, and they haven't had the time to work together as one yet, but you are the captain and need to be aware of it. Just watch yourself. Stanley didn't say anything. He was glad that the chief medical officer had told him about it. His exo had never mentioned any dissatisfaction amongst the crew. He made a mental note to ask Commander Mendez on the status of the crew. Being a new captain amongst some experienced crew, Stanley had been warned by Admiral Harris to expect such grumblings on the ground. And the last thing he needed at a time like this was for his crew questioning his actions. Chapter 27, Captain's Ready Room, UFS Winston. Sheldon glanced at both Lieutenant Storer and Captain Peters, who was seated in front of him. He had summoned the both of them to his ready room after informing Lieutenant Diaz on Armstrong Station that there would be a delay in the boarding process. Diaz hadn't asked him why, which was expected of a junior officer, and Sheldon had decided not to give Diaz a reason for the sudden halt. "I'm sure both of you must be wondering why I aborted the Marine unit boarding onto the station," Sheldon remarked. Peters nodded, while Storer just stared at him. Storer had been with Sheldon long enough to know that he would inform them of the reasoning behind his decisions as and when needed. And sometimes Sheldon never explained the rationale for his decisions, but he knew this was a different situation. Sheldon opened the transmission from Diaz. "I received this from the lieutenant on the station. It is an unknown message that was sent to the station right before Admiral Harris and his commanders disappeared. Initially, Diaz only found the partial translation, but she managed to translate it in time and send it to me." Peters leaned forward to look at the hollow screen with the transmission. Storer stared at it without blinking. "Admiral, what does it mean?" Sheldon turned to Storer. "There may be a link between the alien species and the Trebium." "What's so special about the Trebium?" Storer asked. "I don't know," Sheldon remarked. "Storer, find me the files on the Trebium mineral project. I need to go through those documents." "Yes, Admiral," Storer replied. "Do we know who sent this transmission?" Peters asked. "I've asked Diaz to find that out, but so far she hasn't come up with any new information," Sheldon replied. "To be frank, the translation of the rest of the transmission was a win for us. It may have saved your unit from an imminent attack." Storer raised his eyebrows. "Do you mean that the aliens who were behind the disappearance of Admiral Harris and the station commanders may still be on the station?" Sheldon nodded. "We must assume that possibility. Captain Peters here also has a theory, which I think is becoming more and more plausible. Would you like to share that with Storer?" Peters didn't flinch as he shared with Storer on the aliens and the Trebium while Sheldon looked on. He had to give credit where it was due. The Marine captain's theory was sounding less and less like a theory. Storer paused for a bit. "If that's the case, we are quite safe on this vessel." Storer's response was as expected. Sheldon knew this was why the lieutenant would probably remain at his rank and retire from the UFS. He was unable to see beyond what was right in front of him. "It's still a theory," Peters cautioned. "We haven't proven it." Storer asked the question on everyone's mind. "How do we prove it then?" Peters shook his head. "I don't know." Sheldon eyed the two of them. "Lieutenant, do we have any spare Trebium on board this vessel?" "I'll need to check," Storer replied. Peters must have picked up on his plan. "Admiral, I see where you're going with this. If we had access to the Trebium mineral, we could use it as a shield of some sort for my unit." They had no time to go back to the shipyards and get more Trebium. Sheldon knew they had limited time to act. They would have to make do with whatever Trebium was available on board this vessel. "I was even thinking that it could be embedded into your armor," Sheldon added. A smile crept along the face of Peters. "That would work nicely, sir." Chapter 28, Captain's Ready Room, UFS Intrepid. "Captain, we are in orbit around Lenova 1, Commander Mendez reported. Stanley nodded. During the encounter with the alien ship, they had been forced to break orbit and move the UFS Intrepid away from Lenova 1. However, he had felt there was still something on Lenova 1 and that they needed to investigate. "Have you started doing the scans of the surface?" Stanley asked. "Yes, Captain," the XO replied. Stanley again waited for his XO to update him, but as usual, that didn't happen. "Have the scans identified anything unusual?" Stanley asked, trying not to lose his patience with his XO. "The results of the scans have been sent to your console," the XO replied. Stanley frowned. He was irritated with his XO. Why hadn't Mendez said that at the beginning? Stanley pulled up a hollow screen and clicked on the files. He examined the results of the scan. It highlighted a cluster of energy readings on the eastern side of Lenova 1. He decided to tap on his XO's wealth of experience. "What do you make of these energy readings?" Mendez paused for consideration. A single energy reading could be nothing but an old vessel. However, a cluster of energy readings may imply more than that, sir. Again, his XO liked to beat around the bush without getting to the point. "Such as?" Stanley asked. "A facility of some kind," the XO said. "The cluster could indicate a base." "I thought the UFS hadn't initiated any establishment of bases on Lenova 1 yet," Stanley remarked. Mendez nodded. "I checked the system. There's no record of any base being set up by the UFS on Lenova 1. Stanley stared at his XO. It meant that someone else, most likely being the Rookley, had established a base on Lenova 1. He couldn't understand how it had slipped out of the sensors of Euphra. Armstrong Station and other sensor arrays in orbit around Euphra had specifically been put there to scan the region of the space. That included Lenova 1. Their scans should have picked up such energy readings, even if they were faint ones, and such readings should have triggered further investigations. It seems like the UFS had a lapse in identifying this base, the XO added. A lapse was putting it mildly. This was a serious breakdown. Even if the orbital defenses had missed it, the roaming UFS destroyers should have picked it up during their routine patrols. Why hadn't our destroyers picked it up, Stanley mused. "Those are our older class vessels, sir," Mendez replied. Their sensor arrays may not have been the most advanced to pick it up. Even our ones only managed to detect an initial faint reading. Then, on my orders, our sensor officer managed to tweak the sensor array until he got a clearer reading. It did take a bit of time for the sensor officer to get it done. His Exo's argument made sense. If any of the older class destroyers had picked up a faint signal, they would have simply ignored it, knowing Lenova 1 was uninhabited. Despite that, the fact that Lenova 1 was uninhabited and emitting energy readings should have been a warning. Stanley also realized he was too young to know how the more experienced captains handled things. They may have not been used to roaming around Euphra, considering the fact that most of them would have come from their days of roaming about Earth. He knew he was finding excuses for the complacency that had set in with his more experienced peers. The UFS had been slow in planning to replace not only the aging fleet of vessels, but their captains. Fortunately, Admiral Harris had pushed through the funding to develop the new breed of destroyers. That initiative had infused a new level of energy and excitement into the UFS. However, it appeared there had not been the same push factor to train the new captains. Stanley knew he was amongst the first of a new generation of captains that had been solely trained on Euphra. Considering Euphra had been colonized over 50 years ago, it was shocking the training of captains had only started several years ago. I need you to take a unit down in the shuttle to investigate the facility or base or whatever it is, Stanley ordered. Yes, Captain, the XO replied. Stanley had expected his XO to say something against the order, but he remained quiet. Is there anything else you need us to do, sir? Mendez asked. Stanley shifted in his seat, but decided he needed to find out. How's the crew? The XO looked puzzled. The crew, sir? I have heard that some amongst the crew are unhappy with my decisions as of late, Stanley said. The XO's face changed. Who told you, sir? Stanley ignored his question. It is true then. He had expected it to be true, but still hearing it from the lips of his XO didn't make it any easier to swallow. A few of the crew had said some things in the mess hall, but I had put a stop to it there and then, sir. The XO highlighted. You are the captain. There's nothing for them to grumble about. Whether they like your actions or not, it's none of their business. As I told him, you are the captain and we follow your orders. Stanley sensed the passion in Mendez's words. His XO believed everything he had just said. Stanley understood that this was why Admiral Harris had posted him to UFS Intrepid. Despite his years of experience, Mendez was loyal to the chain of command, and he would go to great lengths to ensure it was adhered to by the entire crew. Would you like me to send you the names of the crew that I heard grumbling in the mess hall? The XO asked. Stanley was taken back by the request. That won't be necessary. You are the XO. I trust you to handle such situations. The XO nodded and seemed pleased by Stanley's response. Stanley knew he had to rely on his XO for these matters. He didn't have the time to deal with a few crew members' unhappiness. Just like anything in life, no one got to pick their captain, XO, or even their post. But as XO, the next time you hear such chatter amongst the crew, let me know, Stanley said. Yes, Captain, the XO said. Now, let's focus on Lenova 1 and finding out what is actually down there, Stanley said. Chapter 29. Outside the airlock, UFS Winston. Marine Captain Peters looked down at the additional armor plating over his body. The Trebium armor was heavy. It added another layer to an already heavy combat outfit. He gripped his weapon on his right hand and waited. Storen had been swift and resourceful in securing any available Trebium on board the UFS Winston. Fortunately for everyone, as the vessel had been launched without a proper cleanup, there had been Trebium plates lying around several storage rooms in the lower decks of the vessel. Storen had then got his crew to weld the Trebium plates onto their body armor. The crew had also been able to create a few Trebium neck bracelets for Peters, Cruz, and 2 of his men. Other than the head, Peters had to admit this was as good as it was going to get to protect most of their body. No one still had been able to determine how the aliens managed to get so close to a human to invade their body. The only thing they knew, to a certain degree, was that the Trebium served as a barrier to the aliens. Despite that, they didn't know why Trebium was a barrier or how it prevented the aliens from going into a human body. Based on the amount of Trebium available and the time needed to weld the armor plate, Peters had decided to only have a small group go with him into the space station. He had left the decision to Cruz to decide who would be the lucky 2 to join them on this mission. Once the 4 of them had suited up into their body armor, Peters had led them down to the airlock. Cruz shuffled her feet beside him. This armor plate is heavy. I'm aware of that, Lieutenant, Peters said. You better get used to moving around with it. If not, we will end up being a sitting target for the alien species. Yes, Captain, Cruz said. Are you so sure the aliens are still on the space station? I believe so, Peters replied, but I don't know how many of them are there. It could be a single one or a group. We need to be ready for any eventuality. He sounded confident in his answer. Yet, if there are multiple aliens on board, he knew they were in for a fight of their lives. This was different from what had happened outside one of the domes at Euphra shipyards. Cruz nodded. Peters observed Cruz trying to move her arms and twist her body so as to get better control of the body armor. Peters looked at his head-mounted display. It indicated a countdown for when the airlock would open. They still had a few minutes to go. Weapons check, everyone, Peters ordered. His perception of Admiral Sheldon had changed ever since the Admiral had stopped them from going on board Armstrong Station. Sheldon's plan of using Trebium as armor had again shifted his view of the Admiral. While Sheldon may not have had the deep experience of the other leaders, Peters had to admit the man was a thinker when he needed to be. Maybe his father hadn't been completely correct on his assessment of Sheldon. It would be the first time that had happened, but it didn't mean it wasn't possible. Or possibly Sheldon had risen to the challenge. "All ready, Captain," Cruz said. Peters glanced at his modified assault weapon. It served as a magwell weapon, and every one of his unit members had one. Based on their intense training, his unit was well versed in the use of the weapon. It was a state-of-the-art assault weapon that had been recently upgraded to contain a 500-round magazine. Each of the members in his unit also carried with them an extra 2 magazines, which he felt was more than sufficient. "Cruz, I want you to take point," Peters ordered. There was a beep on his head-mounted display. It was time to go. Cruz shuffled her feet and got into position ahead of Peters as the airlock opened, and they walked through it onto the space station. Chapter 30. Bridge, UFS Intrepid. Stanley had his eyes glued to the view screen. The shuttle was nearly reaching the surface of Lenova 1. He knew the danger he was sending his EXO and team into, but they needed to know what the Rukli were doing down there on the surface. He hadn't taken the time to seek permission from Admiral Sheldon. He really was on his own here. If there was a Rukli base on the surface, it had to be investigated. The EXO had chosen a team of 5 to join him on this mission. Stanley had left the details to his EXO, knowing full well he would pick the right group of people. "Captain, the team has touched down on the surface of Lenova 1, the sensor officer reported. This was probably the first humans to have set foot on Lenova 1. Stanley recalled from reading the records that drones had been sent down to scan Lenova 1's surface when Euphra had been initially colonized. However, those drones had reported back that there were no signs of life on Lenova 1 and 2. Following those initial readings, there had been sparse records on Lenova 1. As the EXO had said, humanity had conveniently forgotten about Lenova 1, while their attention had been focused on building up Euphra. Stanley knew that had been a mistake. "Any signs of other hostile vessels?" Stanley asked. "Negative, sir," the sensor officer replied. From their encounters, there were at least 2 Rukli vessels out there somewhere. However, that didn't mean there weren't more. The Rukli could have a number of vessels roaming around Euphra and Lenova 1. They had to be ready for all scenarios. "Video footage coming online now, sir," the tactical officer reported. The view screen changed to display the video from the EXO's head-mounted device. 2 armed men were ahead of the EXO as they walked towards the area of the energy readings. All of them were in suits, as the atmosphere of Lenova 1 wasn't conducive for humans. Stanley opened the private comms link to his EXO. "Approach with caution. We don't know if there are still Rukli inside there." "Acknowledge, Captain," the EXO whispered. A small structure began to become visible on the view screen. Stanley's eyes widened. It wasn't a single structure, but several of them. The Rukli had been quite busy. The base must have been set up over time. The multiple single-level structures hinted to the fact that this base wasn't set up overnight. He realized that he was being presumptuous in linking the Rukli to the base, even before his team had stepped into any of the structures. But if not, who else could it be? "We're heading into the centermost structure," the EXO said. "So far, our scans indicate no life signs and no distortions either." Prior to leaving the UFS Intrepid, the EXO and his team had modified their devices to scan for distortions. Stanley hadn't been sure if it would be effective on the surface, but it's better than nothing. The 2 men in front of the EXO began to move a bit more rapidly as they approached the centermost structure. They jumped from one covered position in the terrain to another. In a few minutes, they were right outside the door to the structure. The first 2 men positioned themselves on each side of the door, while another leveled his weapon and pulled the door open. It was dark inside. The men turned on their head-mounted lights and stepped inside, followed by the EXO. Stanley raised his eyebrows. There was a large room on the view screen. At the center of the room was a cluster of tables with workstations. 2 of the men swept the entire room quickly and signaled everything was clear. Then the EXO moved towards the centermost table. Stanley squinted his eyes. Each of the workstations were marked by symbols, some of which were below the controls. "What are those?" Stanley asked through the comms link. "It appears to be a language, sir," the EXO replied. It was one more set of evidence which confirmed that this base had been established by an alien species. Stanley suspected this was the alien species' language. "Is the translator able to understand the symbols?" Stanley asked. "Negative, Captain," the EXO replied. The display in every head-mounted device included a visual translator that was able to provide real-time translation. Without the ability to translate symbols, the team wouldn't be able to make much progress on the base. "There's nothing else here," the EXO remarked. "We'll do a quick check of the other structures, but I don't think we'll find anything, sir." There was no need to keep the team there any longer. "Take images of the symbols and bring them back," Stanley ordered. "We can get our science officers to study them." Chapter 31, Deck 2, Armstrong Station. Lieutenant Diaz was standing a few meters away along a corridor with one of her men as Peters followed Cruz onto the space station. Peters was surprised to find that there were only two people waiting for their arrival, and neither of them were armed. What was going on here? Hadn't someone briefed Diaz and her crew member on the potential danger on the space station? Diaz extended her hand. Welcome on board Armstrong Station. Is this your first time here? The lieutenant was acting as if she was formally welcoming them onto the space station. Peters nodded. Lieutenant Diaz, I presume? Yes, Captain Peters, Diaz said. At least someone had briefed her that he was leading the boarding party onto the station. Peters didn't have time to waste with all the pleasantries. The reason we had a delay in boarding was because we believed the alien who took out your superiors is still on board. Diaz's face turned pale. Are you certain? It was obvious Diaz hadn't even contemplated the possibility that the alien would still be around the station. A more experienced officer would have been able to make the connection that the alien may not have left the station. Peters understood that she was a junior officer put in charge of a space station by necessity. Pretty certain, Cruz remarked as she got the two men to get into position along the corridor. What's the status of the station? Peters asked as he glanced further down the corridor. Diaz's voice was shaky. We only have about 20 officers on board. I managed to get a few of the remaining lieutenants to take charge of the operations center. Peters was glad that the seriousness of the situation had gotten through to Diaz to some extent. He interrupted her. You need to secure the weapons facility and engineering immediately. Diaz nodded and began speaking through a comms link. Peters bit his lip. He still wasn't pleased that no one had advised the Armstrong Station crew on board that the alien could be still around. He would need to have a word with Lieutenant Storen when he got back on board the UFS Winston. Such lapses were unacceptable, especially in this crisis situation. They needed to tighten up all the protocols. Diaz turned their attention back to him. It's done, sir. Okay, Peters highlighted. Take us to the operations center. Diaz and the officer with her began leading them down the corridor. Peters turned to Cruz. She had taken out a device and was using it to scan for any distortion. Prior to leaving the UFS Winston, Peters had suggested to Cruz to modify her device to scan for any sign of a distortion. His theory was simple. Each time the alien species had appeared, it had come right after a distortion. If they were able to scan for a distortion, they might be able to detect the alien species' movements and preempt any further strike by them. Cruz had been impressed by his theory, but Peters knew it was still only a theory and meant nothing until proven. They followed the corridor as it went around a corner. Diaz glanced back at them. It'll take us a few minutes to reach the operations center. Peters nodded and kept glancing about. Why are the lights dim? I activated the emergency protocols on the station once we found that Admiral Harris and the rest had disappeared, Diaz replied. Then Cruz stopped. Captain Peters stopped in his tracks and leveled his weapon in front of him. He quickly gestured for his two men to get to the front of the group. What is it? Peters whispered. My device picked up a faint distortion ahead of us around the next corner, Cruz admitted. Peters motioned for Diaz and an officer to be silent as he motioned Cruz and one of his men to take the lead. They all slowly inched forward until they came around the corner. Confirmed, Cruz yelled as weapons fire rang out through the corridor. Chapter 32, Deck 2, Armstrong Station. The barrage of weapons fire continued. Cruz was on the ground, firing her mag-rail weapon. Peters heard her shouting to his other two men. Meanwhile, he had insisted that Diaz and her officer stay at the rear of the group as his unit engaged with the alien. Peters knelt and crawled over to Cruz. What's the status? The thing, the alien, whatever it moved lightning fast, Cruz reported. Did you get a direct hit on it? Peters asked. Negative, sir, Cruz said in frustration. It was bouncing from the left to the right of the corridor. I couldn't get a clear shot at it. The dim lights in the corridor didn't help either. Somehow the alien was able to blend in with the dimness in the corridor. Peters frowned. He had known the dim lighting would be an issue, but not to the extent that it would provide a camouflage to the alien. It was also possible that the alien had the ability to change skin color to blend in with its surroundings. If that was the case, it would make it much harder to track the alien and take it down. He stood up. Stop firing. There was no point in wasting their magazines if they couldn't even get a single hit on the target. How many aliens did you detect? Diaz asked. Cruz checked with his two men. Although it was moving fast, we counted only one alien. Peters turned to Diaz. Does this corridor pass by any other rooms? Yes, it passes a mess hall before the corridor ends at the operations center, Diaz replied. But the entrance to the operations center requires an access code. Then the alien has no choice but to go to that mess hall, Peters remarked. Let's move quickly. We don't have much time. Cruz led the group as they raced down the corridor. In a few seconds, they were standing beside the open door leading into the mess hall on the right side of the corridor. Peters gestured to his two men. No one enters or exits this mess hall without my permission. No one. Understand? The two men nodded and took their position at the open entrance to the mess hall. Peters stepped inside the mess hall with Cruz behind him. Diaz and an officer were one step behind him. The mess hall was a big one. It had two long windows with a view overlooking Euphra. There were two groups of people standing about on either end of the mess hall. All of them looked up as Peters walked further into the mess hall with his weapon in front of him. Everyone, please continue with your business, Diaz announced. However, no one is allowed to leave the mess hall until I say so. The two groups of people looked away and went back to talking amongst themselves. One group sat down at the table next to one of the long windows. Peters glanced around the mess hall. What does your device indicate? Cruz shook her head. Nothing. Where'd it go? It's inside one of these people, Peters murmured. He suspected his lieutenant's device scanner was unable to detect the alien's distortion once it jumped into a human body. At a later time, they would need to modify the device scanner further to sharpen its detection even when the alien was inside a human body. It could be any one of them, Cruz whispered. Diaz turned to him, careful not to show her alarm to the rest of the crew in the mess hall. Do you mean the alien can occupy a human body? Peters nodded as he recalled the report he had seen from the UFS Intrepid. It had highlighted that the alien was able to take over a human body. The alien had the ability to use a human as a host. He also remembered that the UFS Intrepid had found a way to track the alien even inside a human body. It could be any of these 7 people here, Cruz admitted as she glanced around the mess hall. Why don't we just line them up and check them one by one, Diaz inquired. That would have been the most logical next step, except for one thing. Peters didn't know how to detect the presence of an alien in a human body. Right now, he wished he had the technology the UFS Intrepid had used. Cruz turned to Diaz. The problem is we don't have a way to detect it once it's inside a human body. But the alien doesn't know that, right? Diaz murmured. Peters turned to face Diaz. He was impressed by the officer's thinking. The lieutenant had a valid point. The alien was probably thinking they didn't have a way to detect him. But Peters was sure the alien couldn't be so sure about that fact. It was time to test how intelligent this alien really was. Line them up, Peters ordered. Diaz turned to face the mess hall. Everyone, we need your help to line up while we do some simple checks. It will be fast and non-invasive. And after the check, you're free to leave the mess hall. With that, Cruz moved towards the center of the room. There was a shuffling of feet as the group seated near the window began to stand. The other group walked closer to Cruz. But before she could say another word, multiple things seemingly happened at once. There was a sound. One of the crew who had been seated collapsed onto the floor and his body disintegrated upon impact. 2 other nearby crew members in the same group began to shout and scream the moment the body disappeared. The alien that emerged from the disintegrated body moved rapidly around the mess hall. Everyone down, Peters shouted. The rest of the crew in the mess hall fell onto the ground. Weapons fire pierced the mess hall as Peters and Cruz tried to target the alien, but it was too fast. It kept jumping from window to even the ceiling of the mess hall, and then it was gone. Cruz stopped firing. Where'd it go? Peters stared at everyone on the floor of the mess hall. It's in one of those remaining crew. Everyone, stay calm, Diaz shouted. Nobody is to make any sudden movements. Peters realized Diaz was trying to get control of the entire situation. However, he wasn't sure if that would work. In response to his concern, a male crew began to get up from the floor. This is crazy. That thing was in one of us. We cannot just wait here for it to kill us one by one. You need to do something now. Peters sensed the panic in the air. He aimed his weapon at the male crew, who by now was standing. Stand down now, Peters bellowed. If not, I will be forced to shoot you. The male crew stared at him intensely while the rest were still on the floor. Peters heard one female crew begin to sob. Diaz was about to walk over to her side when Peters grabbed her shoulder. The alien was in one of those remaining 6 crew members. He couldn't risk any one of them getting close to the 6 people. Then a second male crew stood and looked at him defiantly. You cannot shoot us all. If we stay here, we are dead. I'm not going to ask again, Peters said. I want everybody back on the floor now. Chapter 33, Bridge, UFS Winston. Admiral, we have contact, Storen announced. Bring it up on the view screen, Sheldon ordered. The view screen flickered and a vessel took up the center of the screen. It was oval-shaped. It isn't one of ours, Storen updated. Is it moving? Sheldon asked. Negative, sir, Storen replied. The alien vessel is holding position away from the station. Shields are up. Is its weapons powered up? Sheldon asked. No, sir, Storen said. That's strange. Hail the vessel, Sheldon directed. If this was the same alien vessel that Captain Stanley had encountered, they should try to communicate with it and determine its reasons for being here. Maybe there was a way to settle all of this. Sheldon knew he was grasping at a sliver of hope, but he had to try. Storen turned to him. I'm getting a reply on the comm, sir. Put it through my console, Sheldon said. He didn't want to further heighten the tension on the bridge. He was able to sense that the bridge crew, who were already inexperienced, were beginning to appear apprehensive ever since the emergence of the alien vessel. The message was short. You are trespassing on our region of space. Sheldon looked confused. Euphra and the region of space surrounding it hadn't belonged to anyone until humanity arrived. He remembered that the early Euphra colonists had scanned the planet and determined it to be uninhabited. That was as much as he knew, and 50 years had passed since then. How was it possible that humanity had never encountered such an alien species during that time? And even if they hadn't, shouldn't an alien species have made its presence known over the last 50 years? Send a transmission asking, who am I talking to, Sheldon ordered. Storen typed into his console and then turned to face him. Completed, sir. Wait a minute, I have another incoming transmission. We are the Rukli, and this is our planet and region of space. Chapter 34, Deck 2, Mess Hall, Armstrong Station. The first male crew scowled, folded his arms and sat back down on the floor of the mess hall. Peter shifted his weapon to the next man still standing. He didn't want to shoot another human, but he would do it if he was forced to. Did you not hear the captain's instructions? Cruz hollered. Get back down on the floor. We will let you go once we complete our checks on each of you. The second man's face distorted and Peters caught a glimpse of the alien's face over the human face. You are a captain of your race? Peters ignored the alien's question and motioned for Cruz to step away. She obeyed and gave him space. Who are you? Peters asked. We are the Rukli, and you are not supposed to be here, the man sneered. Peters realized this was his opportunity to find out more about this Rukli alien species. We came here many years ago. We have not seen you in this region of space before. We have always been here, the man snickered. It's you who are trespassing in our region of space. There was no one on Euphra when we arrived here many years ago, Peters commented. The man tilted his head. What is Euphra? That is this planet we live on, Peters said, pointing to the planet through the long window in the mess hall. Why are you here now? That's none of your business, the man replied. We have always been here. You have to leave our planet. You are not welcome here. Peters recalled that when Euphra had been initially colonized by humanity, there had been teams who had searched across the planet for any forms of life. However, at that time, none had been found. That didn't mean there were no species on the planet. The reality was that Euphra was still a large planet. Had the teams been able to check every part of the planet? Highly unlikely. It was an impossible task for any species to guarantee a planet the size of Euphra was truly uninhabited. Had the initial humans made a mistake? Even if so, the question that continued to bother him was why were the Rukli aliens only showing up now? Peters decided to try a different approach. Why did you kill our people? They were innocent. We did not attack you. People who take over our space and planet are not innocent, the man sneered. They deserved it. Peters realized that was the closest admission he was going to get from the Rukli. This alien species didn't seem to care that they had killed many of the admirals and commanders. The Rukli alien didn't seem to want to negotiate at any level. Can I speak with one of your leaders? Peters asked. The man inched closer. You need to leave this planet or face the consequences. Stop right there, Peters warned. We're not leaving this planet. We've been here for over 50 years. This is our planet. The alien's face distorted over the human face. You don't understand what's coming. Tell me, Peters demanded. He refused to be threatened by this alien species. The man pointed at his shield. You think you can hide in that? It will not protect you forever. Peters was taken back by the fact that the alien recognized the Trebium armor. By the alien's own words, it somewhat proved his theory. The Rukli knew of the power of the Trebium, and it also understood that it couldn't penetrate the Trebium. If you choose to stay here, your species will face extinction, the man warned. If that is what you desire, so be it. With that, the alien jumped out of the body of the man. The man's body disintegrated before it even reached the floor. Peters fired at the alien as it leaped onto the ceiling and then towards the window, and then it disappeared. Cruz rushed towards the window. Where did he go? The window was in breach. It couldn't just disappear like that into nothing. Peters bit his lip. It left the space station. How can you be sure? Diaz asked, as the other crew began to get up from the floor of the mess hall. Get everyone out of here, Peters commanded. Peters couldn't be certain, but he knew the Rukli alien had somehow left the space station. Chapter 35, Captain's Ready Room, UFS Winston. Admiral Sheldon stared out of his viewport at Armstrong Station. They had survived a close call with the Rukli alien species. In his gut, he realized this was only the beginning. The door buzzed. Come in, Sheldon hollered. Peters walked in. Take a seat, Captain, Sheldon directed. Peters acknowledged and sat down in front of him. What's the status? Sheldon asked. Peters updated him on their encounter with the alien on board the space station and what the alien had said. Sheldon eyed him carefully. 2 deaths? Yes, Admiral, Peters nodded. We were fortunate that it didn't exceed that number. I'm sure the Rukli alien could have killed many more of us if it had wanted to, but it didn't. Sheldon wasn't concerned about the small number of deaths. Instead, he was more worried about how they had died. I believe the alien vessel that we encountered must have had something to do with the disappearance of the Rukli alien from the space station, Sheldon mused. I would concur, sir, Peters said. The alien vessel must have been waiting to pick up the alien, but as to how it exactly did that is beyond me. Sheldon drummed his fingers on the table. The alien must have a way of transporting their members off vessels. It must be an advanced transportation system, especially on a space station with no Trebium exterior, Peters added. As you ordered, my men have secured the station. We don't believe there are any more aliens on board it. I had my lieutenant do a scan for distortions of the entire space station. The scan didn't detect anything. Sheldon didn't like the sound of it all. If the Rukli aliens were able to do that, the alien species was far more advanced than anyone had anticipated. Despite that, he had been impressed by Peters' ability to modify a device to scan for distortions. It seemed like the only way forward for them to be able to detect the aliens. Admiral, on your orders, I have asked all personnel on board the space station to get their devices modified modified to scan for such distortions, Peters highlighted. I have also asked Diaz to get the details of the device scanner from the UFS Intrepid so that we can upgrade everyone's devices. The security devices along the corridors of the station will also be modified. It should be done within a few hours. Without a Trebium exterior, it's the only way for the space station and the crew to protect themselves. Sheldon nodded. At least the crew in the space station would have some means to detect against any alien presence. It was the only available measure because the alternative of building a Trebium exterior for the space station was next to impossible. Chapter 36. Briefing Room, UFS Intrepid. Stanley stood at one corner of the round table. The UFS Intrepid had docked with Armstrong Station an hour ago. The journey to the space station had been uneventful, which had been a relief for Stanley. He hadn't wanted to deal with any further encounters with the Ripley alien vessels until he could further discuss the situation with Sheldon. Not to his surprise, Sheldon had requested they meet up for a face-to-face debrief. While Sheldon would never be able to live up to his expectations of Harris, Stanley realized he had to work with the Admiral to counter the new threat. Upon docking at the space station, he had been stunned to find another new destroyer-class vessel, the UFS Winston, at the station. It hadn't taken long for him to realize that Sheldon had used one of the new destroyers from the shipyards and brought it into orbit. A few minutes later, the door buzzed and his XO led Sheldon and another man into the room. As the XO left the room, Sheldon turned to Stanley. Good to finally meet you, Captain. I have heard a lot about you. Stanley walked up to the Admiral and shook his hands. He doubted the Admiral was a fan of his. Admiral Harris had warned him about Sheldon a long time ago. But things were different now. Harris was gone. A new enemy had made its presence known. And Stanley had to put aside whatever Harris had told him about Sheldon and work to save themselves and Euphra from the Ripley alien species. Sheldon motioned to the other man. This is Marine Captain Peters, Euphra Defense Forces. He's the reason I'm still alive today. Stanley smiled and shook Peters' hands, who seemed taken aback by Sheldon's frankness. Sheldon and Peters sat down opposite Stanley. Admiral, I would like to update you on our findings on Lenore 1, Stanley announced. With that, Stanley updated Sheldon and Peters about what they had found at Lenore 1 and their engagement with the Ripley alien vessel. How the heck did the Ripley species establish a base right under our very noses? Sheldon scoffed. Stanley realized it didn't matter anymore. Whoever failed in their duties was probably already dead. There was no point investigating the serious security breach. Sheldon must have come to the same thought as he stopped talking about it. Are we able to translate those symbols? Sheldon asked. My science officers are facing some difficulty figuring it out, Stanley said. I'll send it down to the Science Division 1 for further analysis. Sheldon nodded. Stanley didn't like admitting the weakness of his science officer, but it was the truth. The science officers assigned to the UFS Intrepid were junior ones. Initially, he had hoped there would be at least one senior officer, but that hadn't materialized. And, as expected, the junior science officers had their limitations. What's your assessment of the Ripley? Peters asked. The whole conversation felt more like an interrogation rather than a briefing. Stanley had expected that he would brief them and they would do likewise, but it was turning out to be a bit different. The Ripley vessels were part of an early attack force, Stanley replied. They seem to have been doing a significant amount of surveillance on us and attacked us at the right time. It was well planned and coordinated. Peters nodded. Stanley found it hard to read the Marine captain. He didn't know much about him and hadn't had time to read up on his profile. However, the very fact that Sheldon was depending on him implied that he was an important and capable person. Stanley decided it was time for him to ask a few questions. What did you find out about the Ripley? Peters shared with him the theory that the Ripley cannot penetrate the Trebium hulls on his and their vessels, and even the shipyard domes. Stanley was skeptical. How certain are we of this? Peters explained how they had used the Trebium armor when entering the space station and how the Ripley alien had mentioned it. Stanley narrowed his eyes. But we don't have enough evidence to prove it. No, we don't, Peters admitted. At least not yet. Despite that, Stanley felt the Trebium shield's experiment was credible. It would also make sense as to why the Ripley alien on the UFS Intrepid had been unable to leave their vessel. The Trebium hull may have disrupted their advanced mode of transportation. What about the remains of the dead Ripley in your sick bay? Sheldon asked. My chief medical officer needs more time to study the alien's remains, Stanley replied. Hopefully, we will then be able to find out how the Ripley takes over our bodies and why our bodies disintegrate after the alien exits. It was the best answer he could give the Admiral. There were many more things that they needed to find out about the Ripley alien species. The dead Ripley would be a valuable source of information. Admiral, what's our next step? Stanley asked. We need to keep building more of these destroyers, Sheldon remarked. If this was an early attack force, we are going to need as many vessels with Trebium hulls as possible. For once, I'm glad Admiral Harris pushed everyone to initiate the Trebium mineral project. We need to expand it further and get as much of the Trebium out of the mines. We also need to secure the locations of our leaders using the Trebium. How much Trebium is there on Euphra? Stanley inquired. According to reports, there is a large supply of Trebium on the planet, Sheldon replied. At our current rate of mining, we have only touched the tip of that supply. That means the Ripley must also know that there is an abundance of Trebium here, Stanley mused. Do you think the Ripley are here for the Trebium? Peters asked. Stanley touched his chin. The Marine captain had a valiant point. If the Rookley were after the Trebium, they would stop at nothing to get it. Based on a transmission that was deciphered by Lieutenant Diaz, it seemed so, Sheldon said. However, we won't know for sure until we capture and talk to one of them. But for now, let's go with that assumption. We also don't know where the transmission came from, Peter said. Was someone trying to warn us? If so, who? Sheldon frowned. There are many things we still don't know. Stanley had to agree with both men. The more they shared information, the more the number of unknowns about the Rookley materialized. Sheldon nodded and stood. I need to go down to Euphra and reorganize UFS Central Command. With most of our commanders and above dead, there'll be a lot of new junior officers who'll be thrown into the fire. It's the only way forward for us if we want to be ready for the Rookley. The aliens will be coming for us soon. I just hope we have sufficient time to prepare ourselves. Stanley nodded as Sheldon and Peters left the briefing room. None of them had talked about when the Rookley would be coming back. It wasn't necessary. Chapter 37, Captain's Ready Room, UFS Intrepid. Stanley leaned back in his chair and opened his last hollow-screen conversation with Admiral Harris. The Admiral's face was frozen on the screen. He had never expected that to be the last time he would talk to his mentor and teacher. The Admiral didn't have any family who was still alive back on Euphra, which was probably a good thing. Stanley had already struggled enough when informing the next of kin of those crew had died valiantly fighting against the Rookley. But he knew this was only the beginning of their engagement with the Rookley. He didn't want to imagine how many casualties would occur when they did fully engage with the Rookley alien species. A war was coming and everyone needed to be ready for it. A buzz on his console interrupted his thoughts. He opened a comms link with his exo. Captain, we intercepted a transmission that was sent out of one of the Rookley vessels before it disappeared, the exo reported. Do you know where the transmission was sent to, Stanley asked. The exo paused for a bit. We believe the transmission was sent out of the Vonia system. Lieutenant Diaz was very helpful in getting it translated for us. Stanley narrowed his eyes. Put it through to my console here. The message was simple and yet ominous. Planet surveillance completed. The end.